China was never supposed to fall. It was the factory of the world, the future superpower, the one nation that would never stop rising. But behind the slogans and the skyscrapers, something was rotting. Fake population numbers, trillions in bad loans, vanishing youth, and a communist party that refuses to admit the truth, even as the entire system starts to unravel. Now, the illusion has shattered, the numbers are collapsing, the lies are catching up, and the rise is over. Not because the West stopped it, but because China's own system is tearing itself apart from the inside. In this video, we break down the real reasons why the rise of China has ended and why the fall might just be the beginning. The money that was never real. Let's start with the grandest lie of all, the Belt and Road Initiative. Remember when China was going to rebuild the world? Highways across Asia, railroads through Africa, ports on every continent, a $1 trillion web of infrastructure that would make Beijing the center of a new global economy. It was called a win-win, a modern Silk Road. By 2025, over 150 countries had signed on. But here's what actually happened. The project started stalling, costs exploded, corruption scandals erupted, and country after country started walking away from deals they once celebrated. Kenya built a railway to nowhere, literally. The Chinese-funded line was supposed to connect Nairobi to Uganda, opening up trade across East Africa. Instead, it abruptly ends in the wilderness because the money dried up. The tracks just stop. No stations, no connections, nothing. Billions spent, a railroad that goes nowhere, and Kenya is still paying back the loans. In Sri Lanka, China built the Hambantota port with promises of transforming it into a major trading hub. It failed spectacularly. Traffic never materialized, revenue never came. When Sri Lanka couldn't service the debt, Beijing swooped in and took control of the port for 99 years. Debt trap diplomacy, critics called it. Sri Lanka called it a disaster. The country essentially handed over a strategic asset to China, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. Malaysia halted its East Coast rail link in 2018 after discovering inflated costs and corruption involving the former Prime Minister and Chinese state companies. The project eventually restarted, but only after slashing the budget by a third and renegotiating everything. Even then, Malaysia remains wary. Kazakhstan's Kyrgyz dry port, meant to be a bustling trade hub on the China-Europe rail route, sits largely empty. Graft and wildly optimistic demand forecasts turned what was supposed to be a jewel of the Belt and Road into a monument of bad planning. Even G7 countries started backing away. Italy became the first to signal its exit from the Belt and Road in 2023, admitting the initiative developed disappointing results. And the Philippines? Under a new administration, it cancelled 3 major Chinese-funded rail projects in 2023. The reason was simple: China failed to follow through. One minister said bluntly, "We can't wait forever." The numbers tell a brutal story. Chinese investment in Belt and Road countries fell by more than 50% between 2019 and 2020. And now, over 80% of China's government loans are going to countries already in debt distress. Beijing isn't building empires anymore, it's frantically trying to prevent defaults. The grand vision of a China-led infrastructure revolution has become a patchwork of stalled projects, unpaid loans, and broken promises. Trillions were pledged, what arrived was debt, dysfunction, and disappointment. But money wasn't the only lie China was selling. The people who don't exist. China has 1.4 billion people. You've heard that number 1,000 times. It's repeated like gospel, the foundation of China's power. A massive workforce, an enormous consumer market, the reason China was destined for dominance. Except there's a problem. That number might be off by 100 million people. In 2022, a massive leak from a provincial police database revealed something shocking. China's registered population appeared to be around 1.28 million, not the official 1.41 billion. China's registered population appeared to be around 1.28 billion, not the official 1.41 billion. Tens of millions of people the government claimed existed might be phantoms, ghosts on paper, citizens who were never born. How does that happen? Simple. Local officials in China had every reason to inflate their numbers. Beijing allocates funding based on population. More people means more money for schools, hospitals, infrastructure. During the one-child policy era, birth quotas were tied to political performance. Report too few births, face penalties. Report more people, get more resources. So they lied. They created phantom babies, doubled counted citizens, kept dead people on registry, and over decades these small fabrications compounded into a massive gap between propaganda and reality. Demographers like Yi Fuxian have been warning about this for years. His 2007 book predicting China's population decline was banned for contradicting the official narrative, but by 2022, independent researchers were all saying the same thing. China's population had peaked years earlier than Beijing admitted, and never actually reached 1.4 billion. Then came the 2021 census. The government delayed releasing the results. When the numbers finally came out, they barely showed any growth from the previous year. And in 2022, China admitted that it could no longer hide. The population declined by 850,000 people, the first drop since the famines in the 1960s. Births that year hit 9.56 million, the lowest number in the history of the People's Republic. But even that was probably too optimistic. If the true population is closer to 1.28 billion, then China has already lost tens of millions more people than it's admitting. Up to 100 million people might exist only in spreadsheets, not in reality. The implications are staggering. If China has fewer people than we thought, its economic potential was overestimated. Its workforce is smaller, its consumer market is weaker. Global businesses betting on endless Chinese growth might be betting on a mirage, and when you lie about how many people you have, you can't plan for what happens when they disappear. The birth rate apocalypse. China isn't just losing people to accounting errors, it's losing its future. In 2022, China's fertility rate dropped to 1.09 children per woman. That's catastrophic. You need 2.1 just to maintain a stable population. China is now lower than Japan, lower than Italy, lower than South Korea at its worst. And this didn't happen gradually. In the 1970s, Chinese women averaged 5 or 6 children. By the 1990s, around 2. Today, barely 1. In 2 generations, China went from large families to almost no families at all. This result is a demographic implosion unlike anything in modern history. The median age in China is now 40.1 and climbing fast. 20 years ago, it was in the late 20s. 1 in 5 Chinese are already over 60 years old, and that fraction is about to explode. Meanwhile, the number of young people is collapsing. Each new generation is smaller than the one before. The working age population peaked in 2014 and has been shrinking every year since. In 2022 alone, China lost another 10 million working age adults. Let that sink in. 10 million workers gone in 1 year, and it's only getting worse. The dependency ratio, the number of retirees and children compared to working age adults, is surging. In 2024, China had 44 dependents for every 100 workers. By 2050, it could be over 70. That means fewer and fewer workers carrying more and more grandparents on their backs. The math is brutal, the economics are impossible. Some projections show that China could lose nearly half its working age population by the end of the century. Half. China's economy was built on cheap, abundant labor. What happens when that labor force gets cut in half? But here's what makes it truly catastrophic: the speed. Japan took decades to age. It had time to adjust, to build social systems, to prepare. South Korea saw it coming and scrambled to respond. China? China is aging faster than any major country in human history. Unlike Japan or South Korea when they aged, China is doing it while still relatively poor. Japan was rich when it got old. China is getting old before it got rich. This is what demographers call the middle income trap on steroids. You need young workforce to climb out of poverty, but China threw away its young workforce with the one-child policy. Now it's stuck. Not rich enough to care for its elderly, not young enough to grow its way out. Here's the part that should terrify Beijing. This can't be fixed. The government knows it screwed up. In 2016, they ended the one-child policy and allowed 2 children. By 2021, 3. Xi himself has urged young people to embrace patriotic childbearing. But nobody's listening. After decades of being told one child was best, Chinese society adapted. Urban couples cite crushing costs, housing, education, healthcare. Many women, now empowered through education and careers, are choosing to marry late or not at all. China's marriage rate has plummeted alongside the birth rate. And there's trauma. The one-child policy wasn't just propaganda, it was coercion. Forced sterilizations, forced abortions, steep fines. Entire generations grew up as only children, watching their parents struggle to support 4 grandparents. Now those only children are adults and they're saying, no thanks. Even if China's fertility rate magically rebounded tomorrow, which it won't, it would take decades for those children to become productive adults. The damage is done. The demographic momentum is set. Nothing can reverse it in time. The demographic time bomb isn't coming, it already went off. China is getting old before it got rich, and unlike Japan or South Korea, which aged as wealthy democracies, China's per capita income is a fraction of theirs. It has less cushion, pensions are underfunded, the retirement age is low, and there's no immigration to offset the losses. Foreigners make up less than 1% of China's population, and there's zero political will to change that. So China tried to control the problem, and that's when everything accelerated. The communist chokehold. Here's the trap. The Chinese Communist Party's entire legitimacy rests on delivering growth and prosperity. For decades, the deal was simple. The people give up political freedom, and in return, the party makes them richer. But what happens when prosperity stalls? The party doubles down on control, and that control is now strangling the country's future. Under Xi Jinping, China has centralized power to a degree not seen since Mao. Xi has purged rivals, stacked the system with loyalists, and made himself the unquestioned leader. Dissent isn't tolerated, honest feedback is dangerous, and when bad news is dangerous to report, problems don't get solved, they get hidden. Take youth unemployment. In mid-2023, it hit 21.3%, the highest on record. Millions of college graduates couldn't find work. The government's response? Stop publishing the data. Just delete it. If you don't report the problem, maybe people won't notice. Chinese netizens joked bitterly, if you close your eyes, it doesn't exist. Or look at Zero COVID. For nearly 3 years, China imposed some of the world's harshest lockdowns. Entire cities were sealed. People were trapped in their apartments. The economy bled. But no provincial official dared question the policy because it came from Xi himself. When the approach finally collapsed under the weight of public protests in late 2022, the government reversed course overnight, triggering a massive wave of infections and deaths it was completely unprepared for. That's the cost of authoritarian rigidity. You can't adapt, you can't correct, you can't admit mistakes. And now that same dynamic is crushing innovation. Starting in 2020, Xi launched a sweeping crackdown on China's tech sector. Alibaba's Jack Ma criticized regulators at a public forum and then vanished from public view for months. When he reappeared, he was subdued, broken. The message was clear. No one is too big, too successful, or too connected to escape the party's reach. The entire private tutoring industry, worth billions and employing millions, was obliterated overnight in 2021. Why? Because Xi decided it was creating inequality and burdening parents. So with a single policy directive, an entire sector was wiped out. Investors lost fortunes, workers lost jobs, and the clear message to entrepreneurs everywhere: your business exists at the pleasure of the party. Tech giants were fined, restructured, or dismantled. Ant Group's massive IPO, set to be the largest in history, was cancelled at the last minute. Didi, China's version of Uber, was forced to delist from the US stock exchanges. The crackdown wasn't about fixing real problems, it was about reminding everyone who's in charge. Foreign companies started pulling back, spooked by the arbitrary exercise of state power. If Beijing could destroy a tech giant overnight, what did that mean for foreign investors? One Cambridge professor studying China's business climate said it plainly: Xi's policies are creating a culture of fear which will stifle innovation, leading entrepreneurs to leave China. And they are leaving. Wealthy Chinese are moving assets overseas. Talented youth are studying abroad and not coming back. Even Chinese billionaires no longer believe in the system they helped build. Because the system can't change without collapsing. meaning reform would require loosening the party's grip, transparency, rule of law, freedom to criticize, but the CCP sees that as an existential threat. They point to the Soviet Union's collapse as proof that any relaxation leads to disintegration. So instead of fixing problems, they censor them. Instead of allowing innovation, they crush it. Instead of empowering citizens, they surveil them. It's a closed loop. Problems are solved by the same hierarchy that created them. No external input, no admission of failure. And when the system tightens in crisis, the best people leave. The Great Escape. The smartest Chinese aren't betting on China anymore. Capital is fleeing, talent is fleeing, and with them goes any hope of reversing the decline. Wealthy Chinese have been quietly moving money out of the country for years. Singapore, Vancouver, Sydney, London, they're buying real estate abroad, setting up foreign accounts, getting second passports, sending their kids to foreign universities with no plans for them to return. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, but it's relentless. By 2023, foreign investment into China had slowed to a crawl. Companies that once saw China as the future are now seeing it as a risk. Manufacturing is moving to Vietnam, supply chains are being rebuilt in India. Even Mexico is attracting factories that would have gone to China a decade ago. And young Chinese are checking out in their own way. There's a movement called Tangping, lying flat. Another called Bailan, let it rot. These aren't political protests. There are no banners, no demonstrations. There's something more dangerous. Quiet resignations. Young Chinese are simply opting out, refusing to chase jobs, homes, and marriages they know are out of reach. Why work yourself to death for an apartment you'll never afford? Why have children when you can barely support yourself? Why participate in a system that's rigged against you? College graduates are flooding civil service exams, desperate for the stability of a government job, even if it means lower pay and crushing boredom. In 2023, millions competed for a few 100,000 positions. The private sector, once the engine of growth and opportunity, is shedding jobs. Innovation is dying. Youth employment, before the government stopped publishing the data, was at record highs. Over 21%. 1 in 5 young people couldn't find work, and those are just the ones actively looking. Many have stopped trying. And here's the kicker. Even the elites don't believe the story anymore. In 2022, leaked internal discussions revealed that some Chinese officials privately acknowledged the population crisis was worse than publicly stated, but they couldn't say it out loud. The party's credibility depends on projecting strength, not admitting weakness. So the official line remains optimistic while smart money quietly exists. When confidence disappears, the engine stops. The point of no return. China now faces a reality it's completely unprepared for: managing decline. For decades, the Communist Party's legitimacy was tied to delivering growth, but managing decline requires a different skill set: transparency, shared sacrifice, social trust, none of which the party has ever demonstrated. And here's the brutal truth. The traditional fixes don't work anymore. Massive infrastructure spending. China's already built bridges to nowhere and empty ghost cities. Entire developments sit vacant. Local governments are drowning in debt from the last round of stimulus. Many cities depend on land sales for funding, but who's buying when the population is shrinking? Building more doesn't create growth when there's no one to use it. Cut interest rates and pump credit? Chinese households are already anxious. In 2023, they increased savings and paid down debt instead of spending. Consumer confidence has cratered. You can't force people to borrow when they're terrified of the future. Technology and automation. China is investing heavily in AI and robotics, hoping machines can replace missing workers. But robots don't buy products. They don't pay taxes. An economy needs human consumers with income and confidence. You can't innovate out of a demographic collapse, especially under a surveillance state that punishes creative thinking. Immigration? Not happening. China has no history of large-scale immigration. Foreigners make up less than 1% of the population. There's no infrastructure to absorb millions of immigrants, no political will, no social acceptance. While aging Western countries offset low birth rates with immigration, China can't or won't. Even if China's fertility rate magically rebounded tomorrow, which it won't, it would take decades for those children to become productive adults. The damage is done. The demographic momentum is set. Nothing can reverse it in time. Some of China's problems simply can't be solved quickly, even by a competent government. And China doesn't have a competent government. It has a rigid, paranoid, authoritarian system that prioritizes control over solutions. The system was designed for growth, not decline. It was built to mobilize resources, build infrastructure, and enforce compliance, but it has no mechanisms for graceful contraction, no safety valves, no trust. And when systems designed for expansion enter contraction, they break. This isn't a recession, it's a reversal. The fall has already begun. China's fall won't be loud. There won't be explosions, there won't be a sudden collapse. Empires built on lies don't fall forward, they grind slowly backwards. The signs are already here: stalled construction projects, shrinking workforce, disappearing data, emigrating elites, a generation that's given up. By the 2030s, China's growth rate could hit zero or turn negative. The working age population will be plunging. Debt will force brutal choices. Some provinces might effectively go bankrupt. And Beijing will keep lying about it, because admitting the truth would shatter the party's last claim to legitimacy. The West spent decades assuming China's rise was inevitable. We were told the 21st century would be the Chinese century, that 1.4 billion people marching in lockstep couldn't be stopped, but inevitability only works if the foundations are real. China's foundations were built on fabricated population data, unsustainable debt, and a one-child policy that amounted to demographic suicide, and those foundations are crumbling. The Belt and Road collapsed into debt traps. The population turned out to be 100 million smaller than claimed. The birth rate fell off a cliff, and the Communist Party responded to every crisis the same way, by tightening control, censoring truth, and crushing dissent. Now, all three crises are converging: economic stagnation, demographic collapse, authoritarian rigidity. Each one makes the others worse. China didn't lose its future because of the West. It lost its future because its own system lied to itself for so long that it missed the moment when lies become irreversible reality. The miracle was real, the rise was impressive, but the sustainability was always an illusion. And now the illusion is over. The rise has ended, not with war, not with revolution, but with exposure. The numbers don't lie. The youth aren't coming back. The money's drying up, and the party that built modern China is now the anchor dragging it down. So, here's the question. What happens when the world's second largest economy realizes it's been running on fumes? What happens when 1.4 billion wake up to the fact that the future they were promised has already been sold? We're about to find out. Let us know what you think in the comments, and if you want to see how this collapse unfolds in real time, hit that subscribe button, because the fall of China is just getting started.
Vladimir Putin used to terrify his enemies. Now he fears his friends. After 2 decades in power, the man who once ruled Russia with an iron grip is looking over his shoulder at his own inner circle. From mysterious purges to airborne assassinations, the walls inside the Kremlin are closing in. Billionaires are speaking out. Generals are vanishing, and Russia's most dangerous mutiny didn't come from protesters in the streets, but from insiders who once served him loyally. Putin fears death is coming, not from NATO, not from Ukraine, but from within. And here's the terrifying part: he might be right. So, how did the strongman become the paranoid? Who is betraying him? And who's next? Let's unravel the slow-motion collapse in Putin's empire and the betrayal that could bring him down. Here's a question. What do Putin and his new BFF Kim Jong-un have in common? Look underground to find the real answer. Putin doesn't like traveling by air all that much. He likes to talk about Russian stealth technology, but he probably doesn't trust it on his own plane. There's another way, an underground armored train network that's a lot harder to track. It makes Putin more comfortable because he's pathologically afraid for his life. Those aren't our words. They come from the lips of Gleb Karakulov. Who is that? He used to be an officer with the Federal Protection Service, Russia's version of the Secret Service. According to him, Putin increasingly surrounds himself with an impenetrable barrier of security routines. This might not be as surprising as it seems. Remember those pictures from 2020 in Russia? Putin received visitors behind a table that almost looked as long as a football field because he was so scared of coming down with the virus. That was the first glimpse of the real Putin, the one you don't usually see posing for the cameras. He was actually too well prepared for coronavirus quarantines. He's long quarantined himself from anything that comes his way until it's been thoroughly tested. Like a tyrant out of Greek myth, Putin has an army of food tasters who carefully screen everything on the menu before it ever even gets to touch his taste buds. And they're not alone. There's a private corps of engineers setting up Putin's exclusive communications network, from his dashes, train, plane, and luxury yachts. He apparently only trusts information from these secure devices, set up by the people who call him the boss, and treat him like he's a modern-day pharaoh. And like a pharaoh, his network of palaces is fortified to the brim, and he demanded even more when he decided to launch his war. Wait, special military operation. For example, Moscow now has about 60 air defense systems around its perimeter. It makes sense at first. Moscow is home to the Russian government and 13 million other people. But try this one on for size. Putin has a private estate at Lake Valdai. It's home to his supposed girlfriend and their children. There are at least 12 Pantsir S-1 missile defense systems around just this estate. Some of them were pulled from St. Petersburg to bolster the estate's fortifications, even though the city's been a target for Ukrainian attacks. Why? Protecting himself apparently matters more than protecting the troops at the front, or the civilians in a city of 5.6 million people. Whenever possible, Putin likes to hide behind these defenses. He avoids going abroad whenever he can, even to the countries that aren't obligated to arrest him if he steps foot on their soil. More at 11. But all of these protocols and procedures might not just be complete paranoia. The real reason for Putin's fear isn't just what he sees in the mirror, it's who he no longer sees in the room. One of those people is Yevgeny Prigozhin. He and the Wagner Group helped Russia to get through its darkest period in the war. Back when Ukrainian forces were putting Russian forces on the run in Kherson and Kharkiv oblasts in the summer and autumn of 2022. Wagner then came in and stabilized the front around the infamous town of Bakhmut. But somewhere along the way, Prigozhin started to think that his men were suffering for nothing. So he did the unthinkable. He led a mutiny the likes of which Russia hadn't seen since 1917. He seized the strategic city of Rostov-on-Don across the Sea of Azov from Crimea. Then he took down military aircraft and marched, making rapid progress. He stopped just short of Moscow with hardly a shot fired in opposition. Putin was strangely absent during the crisis. It took the efforts of his puppet, Alexander Lukashenko, in Belarus to bring the situation to a peaceful end. The military's impotence during the affair made him wonder, if the Wagner Group actually made it to Moscow, who would be the first to stab him in the back? Something had to be done, and like a loyal KGB man to the end, Putin decided it was better to strike first from the shadows, until it became public with a spectacular fireball. Prigozhin died under mysterious circumstances a couple of months later when his private jet exploded. Nikolai Patrushev, the secretary of Putin's Security Council, ordered the assassination, but Putin definitely approved. It was a move right out of Stalin's playbook. Putin was sending a message, think twice before crossing me. And just like Stalin, Putin wasn't stopping there. Russian dictators rarely do. The full-blown purge had come back into vogue again. Not even a month after the Wagner revolt, the former FSB man, Igor Girkin, was thrown behind bars. Why? He made the mistake of criticizing Putin's handling of the war in public. In Russia, that counts as extremism. Girkin might have been sympathetic to the war and a spook just like Putin, but that doesn't matter here. Sending the message was what mattered, and the boss still wasn't done. General Sergei Surovikin was suddenly missing at the end of August 2023. Once the leader of Russia's Air Force and then commander of all of Russia's forces in Ukraine, he disappeared, supposedly for being a little too friendly with Prigozhin. Worse, he apparently knew about the mutiny beforehand. So Putin acted. Surovikin didn't bite the dust. He was basically just given an irrelevant diplomatic post in the Commonwealth of Independent States, the 21st century way of being packed off to a dacha in Siberia. But others weren't as lucky as him. That November, Lieutenant General Vladimir Sviridov and his wife were found dead in their home. Sviridov became a critic of the Russian war effort. He said that the Russian military had displayed a lack of readiness. The official cause of death was carbon monoxide poisoning. Then, Roman Starovoyt was found dead in his car on July 7th of this year, just hours after Putin fired him from his job as Russia's transport minister for reasons we don't know. Officially, he committed suicide, and Putin was shocked at his death. Officially. We're taking these things with a grain of salt because there's a pattern here. Between the start of the war and the summer of 2025, at least 24 high-ranking figures in Putin's regime died in mysterious ways. And even the ones that do survive and don't wind up disgraced still have to be walking on eggshells. But that might not work forever. Prigozhin's rebellion revealed just how little support for Putin there is, even within elite circles in Russia. There is, in fact, a quiet war for power going on, and one side is already winning. Fear can only rule the day for so long. The upper tiers of Putin's regime might be under constant surveillance, but a czar needs more than that to stay in power. Even he can't make money appear out of thin air. Russia's economy depends on one thing: keeping the export of natural resources going, especially oil and natural gas. And oligarchs have been allowed to get rich doing it. There was a silent agreement between them and their boss going back to the time he first took power. What's the point of being an oligarch if you can't live like one? The special military operation was supposed to end in a few days. It didn't, and Russia's been under lock and key ever since. So they aren't living as large. Their foreign bank accounts got frozen, their luxury property got seized, and those profitable overseas business deals got killed. Life's not fair. But with Putin putting on his Stalin face, what's the likelihood of anyone really pushing back? It actually didn't take long. Last August, as Ukraine was invading the Kursk Oblast and making Russia's finances go on a roller coaster ride, Oleg Deripaska called for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire and said that Putin was mad to invade his neighbor. That's not a household name outside of Russia, but inside of it, he's one of the people that make the economy move. He's the founder of Basic Element, one of Russia's leading mining, agriculture, and industrial conglomerates. He was once Russia's richest man and now has a net worth of $4 billion, according to Forbes. But was Deripaska speaking only for himself? No. Going out on a limb alone is bad for one's prospects of living long in Putin's Russia. There's a growing list of malcontents. Alexander Novak, Russia's deputy prime minister, warned that if things keep on going as they were, Russia might have to stop exporting energy to secure the home supply. That must have made the oligarchs even more nervous. Then came the real scare. After Ukraine did a little special military operation of its own in Russian territory, Georgy Zagrevsky said that Putin should be removed from power. So who is this guy? The name kind of gives it away. He operates Paladin, another private military company like the Wagner Group. And that had to have given Putin a fear of déjà vu. Even Nikolai Patrushev, Putin's chosen hitman in the Prigozhin affair, apparently voiced his doubts about the direction of the war and speculated about the country's future if Putin got weaker. He was conveniently relieved of his post and appointed as a presidential aide instead, where Putin can watch him more closely. But the problems deepen. As Putin's elite began to cautiously express doubts about their boss, Russia's people are already making their choice more loudly, and it's not him. Putin was re-elected as the president of Russia in March 2024 with 88.4% of the vote. That margin was a little too comfortable. International observers thought there was an unprecedented level of fraud in the tally. Despite that, his regime still needed to force people into voting for him, especially the unfortunates in the occupied territories of Ukraine. But why would a supposedly popular leader need to go to such lengths? You know why. It's tough to live in Russia these days. Hospitals are more overstretched now than they ever were during the pandemic. Power outages in the Russian winter have become common. People are voting with their feet. At least 650,000 Russians have left the country since 2022, and they've been going to over 70 destination countries that seem to offer them a better future than the motherland these days. These are disproportionately Russia's best and brightest people, and they're resisting their dictatorial leader in one of the only ways they know how. To them, he had broken his biggest promise. If they can't make their money, there is no point in staying. Putin came to power at a time when post-Soviet Russia was in chaos. The upheaval forced Boris Yeltsin to resign early, so Putin had to do something fast. His answer was to extend a simple contract. Putin would restore order, grow the economy, and revive national pride. The oligarchs and well-educated would get to make their coin. In exchange, he got to steadily end Russia's brief flirtation with Western-style liberalism. He kept his promise in the 2000s and 2010s. There were some protests here and there, but Russia's GDP per capita steadily rose, from a dismal $1,331 in 1999 when he came to power to $15,941 in 2013. Then it dropped. 2014 was when the little green men took over Crimea and the first round of Western sanctions got slapped on. So it collapsed to $8,663 in 2 years, but then rebounded. In 2022, it was $15,620 again. But the roller coaster was far from done. The early war rush brought a sugar high and things looked okay. But when the blitzkrieg failed and attrition kicked in, things started to change fast. Recessions set in. The Russian economy rebounded in 2023 and 2024, but only because war spending was taking up a third of Russia's federal budget and 6% of its GDP. A ruble spent in one place can't be spent in another, so other things in Russia started to suffer. Inflation made things like eggs and sugar too much for ordinary Russians to afford. Interest rates rose to over 20%. No new businesses or jobs, just a lot of stuff that was now really expensive. The only comfort was that it wasn't getting even more expensive anymore. What's getting cheaper? Housing. Home sales dropped by 40% between the summer of 2024 and this past summer. Good for people looking for a starter home, bad for property values. That's not just the oligarchs losing money on their mansion apartments in Moscow or St. Petersburg. It's ordinary families losing most of their life savings. So that's why Russia's educated people are leaving. The place isn't North Korea, yet, but Russian authorities are going to more and more lengths to crack down on anti-war activists in the country. Protests have declined since the war started, but that might just be plugging the pressure, only for it to show up in another place. Now, with the enemies above and below, Putin's final shield is loyalty, but that too is cracking. People are starting to talk about the unthinkable, a potential successor to Putin. Some of this is natural. He's getting old. He just turned 73. But there's more to this than that. With the economy slowing and the prospect of a decisive victory in Ukraine pretty much impossible, some of Russia's elites are worried about a potential revolution. And he knows it. Abbas Galyamov understands Putin's thoughts more than most. He used to be a speechwriter for Russia's boss. According to him, Putin always absorbs the mood of other elites. That shouldn't surprise anybody. It's exactly what a former KGB man would do. He knows that the likes of Deripaska weren't speaking just for themselves. So Putin has to take other measures, more subtle ones, because even he can't just go around killing everyone and expect the country to continue functioning. The goal? Keep any potential successor obedient, if not silent. Putin doesn't get around much these days. Since he has an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court, he has to be careful about where he goes. All of its 125 member states are obligated to take him into custody the moment he steps foot on their soil. But still, Russia needs to maintain its international relations. Theoretically, it should, because it has a prime minister, Mikhail Mishustin, sort of. Putin seems to be under the impression that Mishustin is a threat to his authority, especially because he doesn't seem to be a hardliner. Putin hasn't moved against him yet, but keeps him close, just like a dog on a leash. He doesn't let Mishustin out of the country much. He sends Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov instead. Why? Because some people think Mishustin is a compromise candidate for a post-Putin Russia. Lavrov isn't a threat. People say he's a faithful weathercock of Putin. That's a double-edged sword, though. Not having a faithful weathercock for a prime minister might wind up doing Putin in if the going gets too tough. Why? Putin hasn't named a clear successor. Surprisingly, that's a tactic out of the playbook of England's Queen Elizabeth I, who knew that there would be a power struggle if she named one. But in theory, the Prime Minister of Russia is supposed to be the second highest official in the country. If something were to happen to Putin, he would take over. In the event of a catastrophic military defeat, or the crash that's sure to come whenever the war spending ends, there's someone waiting in the wings to take over if elites like Deripaska and Zagrevsky decide that enough is enough and make for a better coordinated revolt. Mishustin might be a good compromise for a caretaker government. But other strongmen are waiting in the wings too. There's the Chechen dictator, Ramzan Kadyrov. He was once a close ally of Prigozhin, but even so, he's been good at playing Putin, achieving a high level of local autonomy despite Russia's increasingly centralized state. In May, he declared his desire to retire, but also said that only Putin could make that decision. Perhaps he's just trying to lie low and strike if the time is right, maybe by backing a preferred successor. Russia's minorities, like the Chechens, have taken a disproportionate share of the million-plus casualties, after all. Putin's fall could be the chance for greater freedom. Either way, Putin's image has changed a lot in the past 5 years. Before COVID, he presented himself as a tough guy, a judo black belt, a diver that recovered ancient Greek urns from beneath the waves, a tiger handler. But people should have paid more attention to that hockey game in 2019 when he scored 8 goals and then fell on his face. Since then, he's sat behind absurdly long tables, hides behind fortresses that would make the most paranoid Roman emperors blush, and regularly keeps his thumb on everyone else around him. All this isolation isn't empowering, though. It's alienating, and Russia's mini-bosses are starting to wonder how beneficial it really is to keep their Don around. We do hear the weather in North Korea is great this time of year.
North Korea is disappearing. Not from war, not from an uprising, but from something far worse. A slow-motion collapse that even Kim Jong-un can't control. The cracks are showing. And you won't believe what will truly erase North Korea from the map. On December 5th, 2023, the world saw something no one expected. Kim Jong-un, one of the most ruthless dictators alive, on the verge of tears. Speaking to a room full of mothers in Pyongyang, he begged North Korean women to have more children. A dictator doesn't do that unless something is very, very wrong. Behind North Korea's closed borders, the truth is even darker than it seems. The country is facing a population collapse so severe that experts believe it could wipe North Korea off the map, not in 100 years, but in our lifetime. And it's not just about birth rates. The military is shrinking. The economy is failing. Even North Korea's nuclear program is at risk. So what's really happening inside the world's most secretive state? And what happens when a nuclear-armed dictatorship starts to fall apart? Let's find out. This wasn't just a one-time moment of weakness. On January 1st, 2024, Kim Jong-un officially declared North Korea's declining birth rate a national emergency. According to South Korean intelligence reports cited by Yonhap News Agency, he made population growth a top national priority for 2024. Placing it right alongside his nuclear weapons program. Let that sink in. For years, North Korean propaganda has been all about strength, weapons, and crushing enemies. Now, the regime's own state newspaper, Rodong Sinmun, is publishing weekly articles on birth rates, calling population growth vital for the revolutionary cause. Why the sudden panic? Because the countdown to North Korea's disappearance has already begun. According to the UN Population Division's 2023 data, North Korea's fertility rate has dropped to 1.79 births per woman, far below the 2.1 needed to sustain a stable population. The CIA's 2024 World Factbook backs this up, confirming that every year more North Koreans are dying than being born, and it's only getting worse. March 2024 projections from the Lowy Institute predict that by 2034, North Korea's population will begin an irreversible decline. By 2050, the UN Demographics Unit estimates its working-age population will shrink by 20%. By 2100, based on Population Research Bureau models, North Korea could lose half its people. And it's not just North Korea. The entire region is suffering from a demographic collapse. South Korea's birth rate? 0.75, one of the lowest in the world, according to official South Korean statistics from February 2024. Japan? 1.2, based on 2023 data from the Japanese Ministry of Health. China? 1.7, according to a January 2024 report from China's National Bureau of Statistics, which also confirmed consecutive population declines in 2022 and 2023. The first time China's population has shrunk since the Great Famine of 1959 to 1961. But here's the difference. South Korea, Japan, and China can compensate. They have technology, automation, and immigration. According to the International Federation of Robotics 2023 World Robotics Report, South Korea operates 1,012 industrial robots per 10,000 manufacturing workers, the highest in the world. Japan ranks third globally with 419 robots per 10,000 workers, and China, despite its lower density of 470, now accounts for over half of all new robot installations worldwide. North Korea? It has nothing. No advanced technology, no automation, no outside help. While wealthy countries find solutions, North Korea is on a collision course with extinction. And that brings us to the most shocking paradox of all. A desperately poor nation is experiencing the birth rates of rich countries. That's not how this is supposed to work. Poor countries typically have high fertility rates. Statista data from 2022 shows that sub-Saharan Africa averages 4.53 births per woman. Afghanistan, 4.52. Even Mongolia maintains 2.77, according to their National Statistical Office. So why is North Korea breaking every rule of population science? And what happens when a nuclear-armed dictatorship starts to vanish? The answer takes us back to a moment when everything changed, not just for North Korea, but for the entire world order. After the Korean War ended in 1953, the population surged from 8.4 million to 15 million in just 2 decades, according to North Korean census data verified by the UN. Ironically, the same country now facing extinction once outperformed South Korea economically until the mid-1970s, a fact confirmed in CIA economic assessments from that period that estimated North Korea's per capita income at $1,130, compared to South Korea's $650 in 1976. These are not just statistics, they represent dramatic shifts in real human lives. Professor Hazel Smith of the School of Oriental and African Studies, who conducted extensive research inside North Korea throughout the 1990s, documented how post-war economic success created an illusion of unstoppable progress. Between 1955 and 1975, North Korean propaganda didn't just claim superiority over the South, it boasted that North Korea would soon overtake Japan economically, and for a while it seemed plausible. State media flooded citizens with images of massive industrial complexes, modern apartment blocks, and an expanding education system. For ordinary North Koreans, this wasn't just government spin, it was real, tangible progress. Choi Min-ho, a defector who grew up in North Korea during the 1960s, told researchers at Seoul National University, "We truly believed we were building paradise. My parents had electricity, assigned housing, and free education for their children. Food distribution worked. My father, a factory manager, received special rations, including cooking oil and sugar. Those were luxuries at the time." But beneath the surface, the cracks were already forming. When global oil prices skyrocketed during the 1973 OPEC crisis, North Korea's Soviet-backed economy took a fatal hit. According to declassified Soviet economic reports, North Korea's trade deficit tripled between 1974 and 1976 as energy costs soared. The government had no answers. It couldn't adapt, and with fewer resources to sustain its people, it turned to population control. By the early 1980s, the fertility rate collapsed from 5 children per woman to just 2.8, according to UN Population Division data. It was the first sign of the demographic disaster unfolding today. Then came the real catastrophe. From 1994 to 1998, North Korea suffered one of the worst famines in modern history, the so-called Arduous March. It wasn't just a food shortage, it was a mass death event. Scholars and humanitarian organizations estimate the death toll ranged between 600,000 to 3 million people, anywhere from 3% to 10% of North Korea's population. Think about that for a moment. Up to 1 in 10 North Koreans may have starved to death in just 4 years. But here's what no one saw coming. The famine didn't just kill people, it changed North Korean society forever. Because when the government's food distribution system collapsed, survival fell on black markets and underground trade networks. Women became the breadwinners. With men forced to report to useless state jobs, women took over the economy, launching the Yangmandang markets that still dominate North Korea today. What started as illegal food trading grew into an underground commercial network spanning the entire country. It was a revolution, but not the kind Kim Jong-un feared. And now this revolution is fueling North Korea's extinction. Fast forward to today, and North Korean women are making a rational choice. They're refusing to bring children into a country with no future. Marriage ages have climbed from the early 20s to the late 20s. Each pregnancy means economic disaster for families already on the edge. And here's the explosive truth Kim Jong-un won't admit. The women of North Korea are engaged in a silent rebellion that's more powerful than any military uprising. Mi Jin, who escaped North Korea in 2019, offered a window into this reality. In our neighborhood markets, the women ran everything. We called ourselves grassroots capitalists behind officials' backs. Another defector, Sun Hee, explained the brutal calculus. Pregnancy means losing your market stall for months. Women would pay 2 months' earnings for illegal Chinese birth control rather than lose their livelihood. This is a generational change in action. My mother had 4 children because the state gave us rations, said one defector. I couldn't feed even one child without working 12 hours daily at the market. Multiply these individual decisions across millions of households, and you're watching a nation slowly erase itself. The regime's desperate attempts to reverse this trend reveal just how little they understand the crisis. They've banned contraception, criminalized abortion, offered financial incentives, and even created mandatory matchmaking events for unmarried employees. But they've missed the fundamental reality. In a country where the average state salary equals about $5 monthly, governmental baby bonuses of $20 make little difference when black market activities bring 10 times that amount. You might wonder, with plummeting birth rates, what happens to a military state that can't find new soldiers? The answer is more disturbing than you can imagine. The Korean People's Army, with 1.2 million active personnel, has long protected the Kim dynasty. But that military machine is disappearing before our eyes. Physical standards have deteriorated so dramatically that minimum height requirements for male recruits have dropped from 5'3" to just 4'9", evidence of how malnutrition has literally shrunk the next generation. A defector who served in an artillery unit near the DMZ from 2013 to 2020 described the absurd reality of today's North Korean military in a 2023 interview with researchers from the Database Center for North Korean Human Rights. We spent 4 months a year farming, not training. We were soldiers who farmed, not farmers who occasionally trained. His unit conducted live fire exercises only twice in 7 years. We shouted bang during exercises to save ammunition, he revealed. Our commanders would receive awards for ammunition conservation while we practiced with wooden mock-ups of weapons. The deterioration extends even to elite units. According to a 2023 report by South Korea's National Intelligence Service cited in the Korea Herald, the previously well-equipped Pyongyang Defense Command, responsible for protecting the capital and Kim regime, has begun cultivating large vegetable gardens on its training grounds. Satellite imagery analyzed by NK News in January 2024 confirmed extensive agricultural activity on what were previously parade grounds and artillery practice ranges. But here's a nightmare scenario keeping Pentagon officials awake at night. What happens to North Korea's nuclear weapons when the country can no longer maintain them? Even North Korea's prized nuclear program faces a personnel crisis. The specialized scientists needed for missile development requires years of advanced training. As the educated population shrinks, finding qualified candidates becomes impossible. According to a March 2023 report from the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, North Korea has begun recruiting teenagers with mathematical aptitude from special science schools for accelerated training, a desperate measure to maintain the weapons program as the country depopulates. The physical transformation of North Korea is becoming visible through satellite analysis. Research organizations like 38 North and NK News regularly publish imagery showing changes in population patterns, particularly in rural areas. Their analysis have documented declining agricultural activity in some regions and the apparent abandonment of smaller settlements as people migrate to larger population centers. Reports from defectors and aid workers who have visited the country suggest that rural schools in some regions have closed due to insufficient students, with remaining children traveling longer distances to consolidated facilities. The Seoul-based Daily NK, which maintains sources inside North Korea, has reported on population shifts from rural to urban areas, particularly among younger North Koreans seeking economic opportunities. But while other aging nations adapt through technology, North Korea faces a unique disadvantage that's accelerating its decline. It's one that will shock you when you understand its full implications. What separates North Korea from other aging nations is its technological isolation. While Japan and South Korea offset demographic decline through automation, North Korea remains largely disconnected from modern technology. According to South Korea's Ministry of Unification's 2023 report on the North Korean economy, manufacturing productivity per worker in North Korea is estimated at just 4% of South Korea's level. The vast majority of factories operate with machinery dating from the 1970s and 1980s, much of it originally imported from the Soviet Union or China. The digital divide with the outside world is equally stark. According to Martin Williams, a researcher at the 38 North Project who specializes in North Korean technology, only about 0.1% of North Koreans, primarily senior officials, researchers at major institutions, and certain military commanders, can access even a heavily censored version of the internet called Kwangmyong, Bright Star. This closed national intranet, documented in a 2024 report by the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, contains only government-approved content primarily consisting of scientific papers, propaganda, and educational materials that have been manually reviewed and approved. The vast majority of North Koreans have never seen a real web page or sent an email. Mobile phones, primarily Chinese-made models running modified Android operating systems, have reached approximately 5 to 6 million subscribers, according to figures cited by South Korea's National Intelligence Service in December 2023, representing about 20% of the population. However, these operate on the closed CurioLink network incapable of international calls or internet access. The operating system takes random screenshots to monitor user activity, feature documented by researchers who have examined phones brought out by defectors. According to Recorded Future, a threat intelligence company that monitors North Korean cyber activity, these phones automatically delete unauthorized files and monitor communications for politically sensitive terms. This digital isolation creates not just economic disadvantages, but also severely limits access to information that might change how the population views its situation. The average North Korean has no conception of how rapid demographic change might affect their future, explains Dr. Park So-kil, director of Liberty in North Korea, an organization that assists North Korean refugees. They're experiencing individual economic hardship without understanding the systemic population collapse that contributes to it. For American defense planners, North Korea's demographic challenges create significant long-term security concerns. Pentagon and State Department officials have acknowledged in various public statements that a demographically weakened North Korea would become increasingly unstable. The U.S. Department of Defense regularly conducts exercises that include scenarios involving instability on the Korean Peninsula, as mentioned in unclassified portions of defense planning documents. Security experts widely recognize that one of the most serious challenges in any North Korean instability scenario would be securing nuclear weapons and materials. While specific operational details remain classified, numerous policy experts from institutions like the RAND Corporation and the Center for Strategic and International Studies have published analysis suggesting that securing North Korea's nuclear infrastructure would require substantial military resources deployed rapidly. The fundamental challenge involves intelligence limitations. While satellite imagery and other open-source intelligence can identify major declared nuclear facilities, like the Yongbyon Nuclear Scientific Research Center, security experts acknowledge that North Korea likely maintains concealed facilities that would be difficult to locate during a crisis. In congressional testimony and public statements, intelligence officials have regularly noted significant gaps in understanding the full extent of North Korea's nuclear program. But nuclear weapons aren't the only threat from a collapsing North Korea. Something equally dangerous lurks beneath the surface, a threat that could reach into your pocket or bank account without warning. The country's elite hacking units, responsible for breaches at Sony Pictures and banking systems worldwide, represent some of its most valuable human capital. As the regime grows desperate, these cyber warriors could be unleashed against Western infrastructure or sell their skills to the highest bidder. The humanitarian crisis would be equally catastrophic. International organizations project that up to 3 million North Koreans might flee during a severe governance failure. China, already struggling with its own demographic challenges, has strengthened border defenses specifically to prevent refugee flows. South Korea would face economic shock, absorbing millions of impoverished North Koreans. For global markets, this represents an underappreciated time bomb. While North Korea itself is economically isolated, regional instability would hit South Korea hard, and that matters to everyone. As the world's 12th largest economy and supplier of 60.5% of global memory chips as of 2025, South Korean market disruption would trigger technology supply chain chaos worldwide. But there's an even more complex strategic puzzle taking shape in the shadows. China, North Korea, and Taiwan are connected in ways few people understand, and the consequences could reshape global security for decades to come. What's even more concerning is how North Korea's demographic collapse intersects with Taiwan's security. U.S. defense officials warn that China watches America's response to North Korea as a test case for Taiwan. A classified Pentagon report leaked to the Washington Post revealed that Chinese military planners explicitly reference American response thresholds in Korea when planning Taiwan scenarios. The connection between Taiwan and North Korea has become increasingly explicit in diplomatic and military planning circles. During the February 2023 closed-door Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, a Track 1.5 security forum bringing together officials and academics, a senior retired Chinese military officer reportedly stated, "America's appetite for Asian security crises can be measured by its Korean policy." Though Beijing officially denied this statement when it leaked to the Financial Times, subsequent statements from Chinese Foreign Ministry spokespeople have reinforced similar themes. Li Zhai, a military analyst close to the People's Liberation Army Navy, wrote in a July 2023 article for the state-affiliated Global Times that American resource allocation between the Korean Peninsula and Taiwan Strait represents a zero-sum game that Chinese strategic planners must exploit. The article was later removed from the website but had already been reprinted in several other Chinese publications. A classified Pentagon report prepared for Congress in September 2023, portions of which were declassified in early 2024, revealed that Chinese military planners explicitly reference American response thresholds in Korea when discussing Taiwan contingency planning. According to testimony from Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs Eli Ratner before the Senate Armed Services Committee on February 14, 2024, we have clear intelligence indicating PLA officers view American commitment on the Korean Peninsula as a benchmark for potential Taiwan scenarios. Japan further complicates this strategic puzzle. Japanese defense white papers now explicitly link North Korean instability and Taiwan security as interconnected challenges requiring coordinated responses. Each nation in this complex web is preparing for the inevitable, North Korea's demographic implosion. But there's a wild card that could make everything worse: North Korea's mineral wealth. The country sits on an estimated $10 trillion in untapped resources, including the world's second-largest magnesite reserves and rare earth minerals essential for modern technology. These deposits, currently underutilized, would become the focus of intense competition in any collapse scenario. North Korea's relationship with China adds another layer of complexity. According to trade data compiled by the Observatory of Economic Complexity and the United Nations, China accounts for more than 90% of North Korea's official international trade. This economic dependency has grown more pronounced under international sanctions. Reports from various economic analysts and satellite imagery suggest Chinese companies maintain significant interest in North Korean natural resources. North Korea possesses substantial mineral deposits including coal, iron ore, zinc, and rare earth elements, resources with significant geopolitical and economic value. According to the U.S. Geological Survey and South Korean government assessments, these untapped resources could be worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Several analysts have noted that Chinese firms appear positioned to maintain access to these resources through various economic arrangements. These resources, currently underutilized due to North Korea's limited extraction and processing capabilities, could become more economically significant in scenarios involving political or economic transitions in North Korea. So, what does this all mean for the future? Is North Korea truly doomed to disappear? And if so, what happens to its weapons, its people, and the balance of power in Asia? This isn't paranoid speculation. It's demographic mathematics. Population decline follows predictable patterns, and North Korea displays all the indicators of a state in terminal demographic freefall: sub-replacement fertility, youth emigration, aging population, and economic stagnation. Even Kim Jong-un, with all his nuclear weapons and totalitarian control, can't reverse this demographic death spiral. He can cry on national television, he can beg, he can threaten, but he can't force women to have children they can't afford to feed. And that's perhaps the most powerful lesson from North Korea's coming erasure. Even the most oppressive regimes ultimately face biological and economic realities they cannot control. A country where women choose not to have children is a country with no future. Kim Jong-un has spent his entire rule focused on nuclear weapons as the key to regime survival. But the real existential threat wasn't from external invasion. It was the demographic time bomb ticking within its own borders. North Korea won't vanish overnight. The process will be gradual, marked by increasing instability, economic deterioration, and territorial contraction. But the trajectory is clear and increasingly irreversible. A country that once threatened the world with nuclear apocalypse now faces a different kind of extinction. Not with a bang, but with the quiet absence of children's laughter. So what do you think? Will Kim Jong-un find a way to reverse this demographic death spiral? Or are we witnessing the beginning of North Korea's erasure from the map? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to check out our video, China's Collapse into Poverty is Worse Than You Think, and subscribe to our channel for more great content. Thanks for watching.
Putin promised Russian mothers their sons would only fight for a few weeks, a quick special military operation to liberate Ukraine. Instead, he's fed over 1 million Russian soldiers into a meat grinder that shows no signs of stopping. And now, Russians are finally fighting back. Not against Ukraine, against Putin himself. Soldiers are refusing orders and surrendering en masse. Military wives are staging protests outside the defense ministry. Even Putin's own mercenaries have marched on Moscow with guns drawn. The rebellion is spreading faster than Putin can contain it. About 64% of Russians now want peace talks immediately, the highest number since the war began. Soldiers are shooting themselves in the legs to escape the front lines. Entire units are deserting rather than face Ukrainian forces. And here's the thing Putin never saw coming. This isn't about politics or ideology. It's about survival. Russian mothers are done watching their sons come home in body bags for a war that makes no sense. Russian wives are done being widows for Putin's ego. Russian soldiers are done dying for a cause they don't believe in. What you're about to witness is the story of how Putin's war is destroying Putin's Russia from within. Because when you send 1 million men to die for nothing, eventually even Russians say enough is enough. Let's break down exactly how Putin's glorious war turned into the biggest military disaster in Russian history since World War II. 1 million casualties. Let that sink in for a moment. According to Western intelligence estimates and independent Russian sources, Putin has managed to kill or wound over 1 million Russian soldiers in just 3.5 years of fighting. That's roughly 250,000 dead and 750,000 wounded. Numbers so catastrophic they dwarf every Soviet and Russian conflict combined since 1945. To put this butchery in perspective, Russia has lost 5 times more soldiers in Ukraine than in all Russian and Soviet wars combined between World War II and 2022. The decade-long Soviet war in Afghanistan, about 15,000 dead. The brutal Chechen wars, some 25,000 in total. Putin managed to exceed all of that in his first 6 months alone. But here's what makes these numbers even more shocking. Putin is achieving virtually nothing with this massive sacrifice of human life. Since January 2024, Russian forces have been advancing at an average rate of just 50 meters per day in some sectors. That's slower than the British and French advance during the World War I Battle of the Somme, one of history's most notorious examples of pointless slaughter. Think about that. Putin's modern army, with all its supposed technological advantages, is moving slower than soldiers armed with bolt-action rifles and bayonets over a century ago. And the cost? According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Russia has seized less than 1% of Ukrainian territory since January 2024. They've traded 1 million casualties for roughly 5,000 square kilometers, an area slightly bigger than the state of Delaware. NATO officials report that Russia was losing approximately 1,200 soldiers killed or wounded every single day during May and June 2024. By November, that number had climbed to 1,500 daily casualties. On the bloodiest day in November 2024, Russia lost 1,950 men, more than the average daily birth rate of Russian males. Let me repeat that. Putin was killing more Russian men per day than Russia was producing. But wait, you haven't heard the most damning part yet. Remember March 2022, just weeks after the invasion began? Putin stood before television cameras and made a solemn promise to Russian mothers. No conscripts will be sent to Ukraine. Only professional contract soldiers would fight his war, he assured them. That promise lasted exactly as long as Putin's prediction of a quick victory. By summer 2022, raw 18 and 19-year-old conscripts were being coerced into signing military contracts and shipped straight to the Ukrainian front lines. These weren't hardened professional soldiers. They were teenagers who had been drafted for mandatory military service and suddenly found themselves facing Ukrainian artillery. The stories that emerged were heartbreaking. Young men calling their mothers from trenches, begging for help. Families discovering their conscript sons had been declared volunteers and sent into combat with just days of training. One mother told Russian media in late 2023, "We are horrified because we don't want to fight. They're just kids." Another wrote, "Why are conscripts being deployed for the special operation? It's the state's duty to bring them home alive and well. But Putin's war machine was hungry for fresh meat, and it didn't care about the age of the soldiers feeding it. In 2024, independent Russian outlet Mediazona documented that Russian military courts had prosecuted over 10,000 cases of soldiers refusing to serve, nearly double the number from the previous year. And that's just the ones who got caught and prosecuted. The real number of soldiers saying no to Putin's war is likely 10 times higher. Because here's what Putin never expected. When you ask people to die for nothing, eventually they stop volunteering. But the most shocking rebellion wasn't happening in the courtrooms or the barracks. It was happening on the battlefield itself. Meet Ukraine's I Want to Live hotline, probably the most successful Ukrainian weapon in the entire war. This simple phone number and website, designed to help Russian soldiers surrender safely, has become Putin's worst nightmare. By early 2024, over 26,000 Russian soldiers had contacted the hotline looking for a way out of Putin's meat grinder. The website had been visited tens of millions of times, with the vast majority of those hits coming from inside Russia itself. Think about what that means. Russian soldiers, sitting in their barracks or trenches, were secretly researching how to surrender to the enemy rather than fight for their own country. And they weren't just thinking about it, they were doing it in record numbers. In August 2024, over 100 Russian troops surrendered simultaneously during a single Ukrainian operation in Kursk, one of the largest mass surrenders of the entire war. Ukrainian forces reported that the Russian soldiers simply dropped their weapons and walked toward Ukrainian positions with white flags. Their commanders had fled, leaving them to face Ukrainian forces alone. But mass surrenders are just part of their story. Russian soldiers have gotten creative about avoiding Putin's war. In 2023 and 2024, dozens of Russian paratroopers deliberately shot each other in the legs and arms to earn medical evacuations. They'd rather face friendly fire than Ukrainian fire. Others simply vanished. According to Russian military records, nearly 16,000 criminal cases for crimes against military service, including going AWOL, have been opened against Russian troops since the invasion began. Last year, a record of 20,040 petitions were filed to declare soldiers missing or dead. And in July 2024 alone, Russian military courts processed over 1,000 new desertion cases in a single month. The Russian military response has been predictably brutal. Deserters face up to 10 years in prison. Some units have started tying suspected deserters to trees and leaving them for Ukrainian drones to find, a practice captured on multiple videos circulating on social media. But even the threat of execution isn't stopping the exodus. Why? Because Russian soldiers have figured out something Putin refuses to admit. This war is unwinnable, and they're tired of dying for his delusions. One Russian serviceman summed it up perfectly. I don't want to die here. It's not my war. It's not our war. I don't understand what the hell we are doing here. That sentiment is spreading through Russian ranks like wildfire, and it's not just the soldiers who are fed up. June 3rd, 2024, outside the Russian Defense Ministry in Moscow. A scene that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. About 20 Russian women kneel on the sidewalk, holding handwritten signs, "Bring my mobilized husband home. Enough of this war." Some have brought their children, toddlers holding signs that read, "Please bring Papa home." These weren't professional protesters or opposition activists. These were ordinary Russian wives and mothers, the same women Putin had counted on to support his war. And they were publicly demanding an end to the slaughter. The protest was organized by a grassroots movement called Putin Domoy, the Way Home. Their Telegraph channel has over 37,000 followers, mostly women whose husbands, sons, and brothers were swept up in Putin's September 2022 mobilization and never allowed to return home. The irony was devastating. Putin had declared 2024 the year of the family in Russia. Yet here were Russian families begging him to return their fathers and husbands from his war. One woman, identified as Paulina, captured the bitter absurdity. Why is it the year of the family and I don't have a husband? It's like mockery or taunting. Maria Andreeva, one of the movement's leaders, walked straight into Putin's Moscow election headquarters in January 2024 and confronted campaign workers. I'm interested to know when he will issue a decree that my husband has to be home, she demanded. When a campaign worker suggested she pray, Andreeva shot back, "What will I get back? A man without legs, without arms, a sick man?" These women represent something Putin fears more than Ukrainian missiles: the collapse of domestic support for his war. Russian polling shows that about half of respondents support the women's demands for the immediate return of mobilized soldiers. Among Russians aged 18 to 29, support rises to 69%. Even more damaging for Putin, about 60% of Russians oppose a second mobilization. He's running out of people willing to die for his cause. The Kremlin's response has been typically heavy-handed. In May 2024, the Russian Justice Ministry declared the Way Home movement a foreign agent, a label designed to criminalize their activities. They've started detaining journalists who cover the protests. But you can't arrest grief. You can't jail desperation. And you can't silence the growing chorus of Russian voices demanding an end to Putin's war. Because these women have something Putin's propaganda machine can't counter: moral authority. They're not Western-funded dissidents or liberal opposition figures. They're the mothers and wives of the very soldiers Putin claims to be fighting for. And they're calling his war exactly what it is: a pointless slaughter of their loved ones. But the rebellion against Putin goes deeper than battlefield desertions and family protests. It reaches into the very heart of Putin's power structure, and the results have been explosive. June 24th, 2023, a date that will haunt Putin for the rest of his rule. That's when Yevgeny Prigozhin, Putin's former chef turned mercenary boss, did something unprecedented in Putin's 26-year reign. He launched an armed rebellion against the Russian state. Prigozhin's Wagner mercenaries seized the city of Rostov-on-Don, a major military headquarters, then began marching toward Moscow. For about 24 hours, Russia teetered on the brink of civil war as thousands of heavily armed mercenaries drove unopposed toward the capital. Putin's response revealed just how weak his grip on power has become. Instead of crushing the rebellion with overwhelming force, he cut a deal. Prigozhin called off his March of Justice in exchange for safe passage to Belarus. The message was clear: even Putin's most brutal enforcers were turning against him. But Prigozhin wasn't just rebelling. He was exposing the rot at the heart of Putin's war machine. In scathing videos posted before his revolt, he accused Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and the military leadership of incompetence, corruption, and lying about the war's progress. Most damaging of all, Prigozhin directly challenged the official justifications for the invasion. The war wasn't for demilitarizing or denazifying Ukraine, he declared. It was driven by the personal ambitions of the army leadership. 2 months later, Prigozhin died in a mysterious plane crash. But his rebellion had already shattered Putin's aura of invincibility. For the first time in his rule, Putin had been forced to negotiate with a mutineer. And Prigozhin wasn't the only insider turning against the war. Igor Girkin, a former FSB officer and key architect of Russia's 2014 intervention in Ukraine, became one of Putin's harshest critics. Despite being a hardline nationalist who wanted Russia to defeat Ukraine, Girkin was so disgusted with Putin's war leadership that he began publicly attacking the president. In 2023, Girkin called Putin a cowardly mediocrity and non-entity. He accused Defense Minister Shoigu of incompetence and urged Putin to step aside. This wasn't some liberal opposition figure. This was a man who had helped start Russia's war in Donbass. The Kremlin's response was swift. Girkin was arrested and sentenced to 4 years in prison. But the damage was done. Even Putin's most loyal supporters were publicly questioning his competence. Throughout 2023 and 2024, reports emerged of purges within the Russian military. Generals were fired, demoted, or mysteriously disappeared after criticizing the conduct of the war. In one documented case, General Ivan Popov was reportedly dismissed for complaining that his troops were taking heavy casualties due to lack of support from higher command. The paranoia reached all the way to the top. Putin has concentrated so much power in his own hands that even routine military decisions now require his personal approval. Local officials, terrified of making mistakes, have stopped making decisions altogether. This isn't just political infighting, it's the systematic breakdown of Russia's governing system under the pressure of an unwinnable war. But perhaps the most telling sign of Putin's growing isolation is this: he can no longer hide the scale of his failure from his own people. While Putin's propaganda machine churns out stories about a booming war economy, the reality behind the statistics tells a very different story. Russia is now spending nearly 40% of its federal budget on defense and security, a level of militarization that would make Stalin blush. To put that in perspective, the United States spends about 15% of its budget on defense, and that's considered high by Western standards. But here's the kicker: all that military spending isn't making Russia stronger, it's making it weaker. Putin has essentially turned Russia into a massive military factory, but one that produces nothing but destruction. Russian factories work around the clock manufacturing artillery shells and missiles that get fired into Ukrainian fields. Russian workers build tanks that Ukrainian drones turn into scrap metal within weeks. It's economic suicide disguised as patriotic duty. The human cost is staggering too. Russia faces a labor shortage of 2.6 million people as of the end of 2024, according to Ukrainian intelligence estimates. Young men who should be building Russia's future are either dead in Ukrainian trenches, hiding in basements to avoid conscription, or fled to neighboring countries. Putin's solution? Force undocumented migrants to join the military in exchange for legal status. He's literally recruiting foreigners to die for a war most Russians no longer support. Meanwhile, inflation is crushing ordinary Russian families. Interest rates have been hiked to devastating levels to prevent economic collapse. Non-military businesses are struggling to survive as the state diverts resources to weapons production. Putin promised Russians prosperity through military strength. Instead, he's delivered an economy that only works if it keeps feeding young men into his war machine. And Russians are starting to realize they're not customers in Putin's economy, they're the product being sold. Here's a number that should terrify Putin. 64% of Russians now support starting peace negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. That's according to polling conducted in June 2025, the highest level of support for ending the conflict since the invasion began. Think about what that means in Putin's authoritarian Russia, where criticizing the war can land you in prison. Despite years of non-stop propaganda, despite the threat of arrest, despite the complete control of state media, nearly 2/3 of Russians want this war to end. The shift in public opinion has been dramatic. In early 2022, Putin enjoyed broad support for his special military operation. Russians believed his promises of a quick victory and minimal casualties. They trusted his assurances that Ukraine would welcome Russian soldiers as liberators. More than 3 years later, those illusions have crumbled. Russian cemeteries are filling with fresh graves, while rural regions are being drained of working-age men. In some of Russia's ethnic minority regions, the impact has been devastating. The predominantly Muslim republics of Dagestan and Chechnya, along with the Buddhist majority Republic of Tuva, have lost thousands of their young men to Putin's war. Resentment is reportedly simmering as families realize their sons are being used as cannon fodder for Moscow's imperial ambitions. Since Putin's mobilization decree in September 2022, hundreds of thousands of Russian men have fled the country to avoid being drafted. Georgia, Kazakhstan, and other neighboring countries reported massive influxes of Russian refugees, men who would rather abandon their homeland than fight for Putin. One Russian man who escaped to Georgia summed up the sentiment: "I'm not going to die in someone else's insane war. This is not our war." That sentiment is spreading across generations. The economic toll is becoming impossible to ignore as well. Despite Putin's claims of a war economy boom, the reality on the ground tells a different story. Military families are struggling with inflation and shortages. Local governments can't provide basic services because their budgets have been drained by war spending. By 2024, Russia was spending nearly 40% of its federal budget on defense and security, an unsustainable level that's crowding out investment in education, healthcare, and infrastructure. But perhaps most damaging of all is the generational divide that's opening up in Russian society. Young Russians who have grown up with internet access and global connections increasingly reject Putin's imperial nostalgia. They see the war as a pointless waste of their future, and they're voting with their feet by leaving the country in record numbers. Putin's war was supposed to unite Russia behind a common cause. Instead, it's dividing Russian society more deeply than any event since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that division is about to tear his regime apart. Here's the brutal truth Putin doesn't want to face. His war in Ukraine isn't just failing on the battlefield, it's destroying Russia from within. Every day this war continues, more Russian families turn against him. Every week brings new videos of soldiers refusing to fight. Every month sees fresh protests from wives demanding their husbands' return. Putin launched this invasion believing Russians would rally behind him the way they did after he annexed Crimea in 2014. He thought a quick victory would cement his legacy as the leader who restored Russian greatness. Instead, he's created the very thing he feared most, mass opposition to his rule from ordinary Russians who are tired of sacrificing their lives for his delusions. The numbers don't lie. More than 1 million casualties, 64% support peace talks, record levels of desertion and draft avoidance, mass immigration by young Russians, growing protests by military families. This isn't just war weariness. This is the systematic collapse of public support for Putin's most important policy. And here's what makes it so dangerous for Putin. Unlike previous Russian protests, this rebellion cuts across all of Russian society. It includes soldiers who were supposed to be his most loyal supporters. It includes military families who were supposed to be proud of their sacrifice. It includes regional officials who were supposed to implement his policies without question. When your own soldiers refuse to fight, when military mothers call you a liar, when your closest allies launch armed rebellions, you're not dealing with foreign enemies anymore. You're dealing with the collapse of your own legitimacy. Putin can arrest protesters, he can censor the media, he can threaten his critics with prison or worse. But he can't arrest grief. He can't censor death. And he can't threaten a mother's love for her son. The rebellion against Putin's war started in the trenches of Ukraine, but it's spreading to every corner of Russian society. And once people stop fearing their government, once they start demanding accountability from their leaders, once they realize they have the power to say no, that's when real change becomes inevitable. Putin promised Russians a quick victory and a return to greatness. Instead, he gave them the deadliest war in Russian history and a future filled with grief. The question isn't whether Russians will continue to rebel against Putin's war. The question is how long Putin can survive the rebellion he created. So what do you think? Are we witnessing the beginning of the end for Putin's regime, or will he find new ways to force Russians to die for his imperial ambitions? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Fall of Nations for more deep dives into the stories that are reshaping our world. Power cuts, empty buildings, unpaid workers, silent factories. This isn't rural Africa, it's China in 2024. Entire cities are going dark, local governments are defaulting, and the so-called economic miracle, it's unraveling in real time. Behind the glossy propaganda and censored headlines, China is buckling under the weight of its own success and turning back into what it once was, a broke, brittle, tightly controlled society that's running out of money, people, and time. This isn't a soft landing, it's a controlled crash. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why some experts now say China isn't just slowing down, it's collapsing into a third world future. Let's start with the biggest wealth destruction event in modern history. And no, that's not hyperbole. We're talking about more money evaporating than was lost in the 2008 financial crisis, the dot-com crash, and every other economic disaster of the last century combined. China's property market was once worth over $50 trillion, more than the entire U.S. housing market and stock market combined. For decades, it seemed invincible. Prices only went up. Families poured their life savings into apartments. And why wouldn't they? Real estate was the one investment the Communist Party seemed to guarantee. But that guarantee just shattered into a million pieces. As of late 2025, Chinese home prices have fallen for 29 consecutive months. Nearly 2.5 years of relentless decline with no bottom in sight. Goldman Sachs warns that without significant intervention, prices could drop another 20 to 25%, putting values at roughly half their peak. In Tier 3 cities, which account for 60% of China's GDP, the collapse has been even more severe. Real estate agents haven't made sales in months. And here's what makes this catastrophic. Roughly 70% of Chinese household wealth is tied up in real estate. So when those apartment values collapse, so does everything middle-class families thought they had. Meet the Wangs, a couple from Shenzhen, who did everything right. They saved for 15 years, took out a mortgage in 2021, put down their entire life savings, about $400,000, on a pre-sale apartment from one of China's biggest developers. The building was supposed to be finished by 2023. They'd already picked out furniture, planned where the crib would go. The building was never finished. The developer ran out of money. Construction stopped at the 15th floor, and the Wangs? They're still paying on a mortgage on a concrete skeleton they'll probably never live in. Their down payment, gone. Their monthly payments, funding nothing but interest to a bank. Their future, stolen by a system they trusted. They're not alone. Over 20 million pre-sold apartments across China remain unfinished. 20 million families paying mortgages on empty air, servicing debt for homes that may never exist. And the protests they've tried to organize? Censored, suppressed, erased from the internet as if they never happened. Remember Evergrande? China's largest property developer defaulted on over $300 billion in debt. $300 billion! That's more than the GDP of Finland. Then Country Garden collapsed with another $187 billion. Together, China's property developers now owe more than the entire GDP of France. And most of that money came from ordinary families who trusted the system. The mortgage boycotts that erupted in 2022 spread across over 100 cities. Desperate homebuyers refused to pay for apartments that weren't being built. The government scrambled to censor the protests and launch rescue construction programs. It wasn't enough. It still isn't. You can't restore trust once it's been vaporized. New buyers aren't showing up. In the first half of 2025, new home sales fell another 4%. Construction starts dropped nearly 20%. And the government that was supposed to backstop everything? It's drowning in its own problems. But the property collapse isn't just destroying family wealth, it's bankrupting the very governments meant to save it. Here's something most people don't understand about China. Local governments don't really collect taxes the way Western governments do. For decades, they funded themselves by selling land to developers. Buy cheap farmland on the outskirts, sell it at massive markups, pocket the difference. At the peak, land sales made up 30 to 40% of local government revenue. That money built the roads, paid the teachers, funded the police, constructed the hospitals, maintained the infrastructure that made China's cities function. Now it's gone. With developers bankrupt and nobody buying land, that revenue stream has collapsed. Land auction values have cratered to around 3 trillion yuan, barely half their peak. Over 10% of land offered for auction last year had zero bidders. Not low bids, zero bids. Nobody wanted it at any price. And local governments across China are facing a fiscal apocalypse nobody prepared for. In Henan province, civil servants had their salaries slashed by 50%. In Guangdong, China's wealthiest province, home to tech giants and manufacturing powerhouses, government workers saw pay cuts of 25 to 30%. Some cities can't afford to keep their streetlights on at night. Others have stopped maintaining roads, collecting garbage, or funding public services they'd provided for decades. Tianjin, a metropolis of over 13 million people, got so desperate they started selling off government office buildings just to make payroll. The local government literally couldn't afford its own offices anymore. Chen Wei spent 20 years as a highway construction contractor in Sichuan province. His company built roads, bridges, overpasses, the infrastructure that made China's interior cities accessible. Last year, the local government owed him 43 million yuan for completed projects. He's received nothing. He had to lay off 200 workers. Some of them haven't been paid in 8 months. They keep promising the money is coming, he told a reporter before the interview was scrubbed from the internet. But there's nothing left to give. His story is playing out across the country, because here's where it gets truly terrifying. Chinese local governments have been hiding debt for years through something called Local Government Financing Vehicles, or LGFVs. These are shell companies that borrow money off the books to fund infrastructure projects. High-speed rail lines that nobody rides, financial districts that sit empty, airports with no passengers, all built with borrowed money that was never supposed to appear on any official balance sheets. The IMF estimates this hidden debt now exceeds 65 trillion yuan. Compared with official local government debt of nearly 48 trillion yuan, the total reaches a staggering 134 trillion yuan. That's roughly $18 trillion, bigger than the economies of Japan and Germany combined, bigger than China's entire official GDP. And most of these LGFVs can't pay their bills. Their median return on assets is around 1%, but their average interest rate? Over 5%. The math doesn't work. Nearly half of them would be operating at a loss without massive state subsidies. A leading Chinese economist recently revealed that local governments have accumulated over 10 trillion yuan in unpaid arrears to contractors and civil servants by the end of 2024. Workers who build highways haven't been paid. Companies that supplied materials are owed millions. Retirees are seeing benefits cut. The whole system is choking on IOUs nobody can honor. Beijing announced a 12 trillion yuan debt restructuring package in late 2024, the largest policy intervention ever targeting local governments. They called it a solution. Analysts called it extend and pretend, because that package covers maybe 25% of the actual problem. The rest? They're just rolling over loans, pushing payments into the future, hoping something magically changes. It won't. And just when you think the picture couldn't get darker, the factories that made China rich are packing up and leaving. For 40 years, Made in China was stamped on everything you owned. Phones, clothes, electronics, toys, furniture, appliances. China was the world's factory floor, and that status lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty. It was the foundation of the entire economic miracle. That era is ending. In May 2025, Apple CEO Tim Cook made an announcement that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. The majority of iPhones sold in the United States would now come from India. Not China, India. And Vietnam would be the country of origin for almost all iPads, Macs, Apple Watches, and AirPods sold to American consumers. Let that sink in. Apple, the company that practically built its empire on Chinese manufacturing, is moving out fast. The numbers are staggering. In the first half of 2025, iPhone production in India surged 53% compared to the previous year. India exported over $22 billion worth of Apple products. The volume of made-in-India smartphones shipped to the United States jumped 240% year over year. And for the first time in history, India overtook China as the top exporter of smartphones to the United States. India now accounts for 44% of U.S. smartphone imports. The world changed while most people weren't paying attention. Apple isn't alone. Samsung closed its last factory in China years ago and now produces the majority of its smartphones in Vietnam and India. Nike makes more shoes in Vietnam than in China. a reversal from just a decade ago. Sony, Dell, HP, Google, they're all diversifying away from China at an unprecedented speed. Even Chinese companies are fleeing their own country. BYD, China's electric vehicle giant, and one of the few genuine Chinese success stories, is building factories in Mexico, Thailand, Hungary, and Indonesia rather than expanding at home. Why is everyone running? First, Chinese labor isn't cheap anymore. Factory wages have tripled in the last decade. Workers in Vietnam cost half as much. In India, even less. The low-cost advantage that made China the world's factory, the core competitive edge that powered decades of growth, is gone. Second, Xi Jinping's government has been unpredictable and paranoid. That 2023 anti-espionage law spooked every foreign company operating in China. When basic market research can get you arrested for spying, when checking production numbers at your own factory might constitute espionage, executives start looking for the exit. Foreign direct investment collapsed by over 80%. Companies aren't just diversifying, they're fleeing. Third, COVID exposed the catastrophic danger of depending too much on one country. When Chinese factories shut down during lockdowns, global supply chains collapsed overnight. Companies couldn't get parts, products couldn't ship. The just-in-time model became just too bad. Executives learned a brutal lesson they won't forget. Concentration is existential risk. And fourth, perhaps most importantly, the workers themselves are disappearing. But there's something even more permanent than fleeing factories. Something China can never buy back, build back, or recover. Something that guarantees decline for generations to come. In 2024, China's population fell for the third consecutive year. More coffins than cradles. More deaths than births. And the gap is widening every single year. The numbers are brutal. 9.5 million babies were born in 2024. But nearly 11 million people died. That's a net loss of almost 1.5 million people in a single year. And demographers say this is just the warm-up act. China's fertility rate has collapsed to around 1 child per woman. To maintain a stable population, you need 2.1. China isn't even halfway there. It's now approaching South Korea's catastrophic 0.73, the lowest fertility rate on Earth. Some Chinese cities have rates even lower than that. The one-child policy worked. It worked too well. It broke something fundamental in Chinese society that may never heal. But here's what really terrifies Beijing. By the end of 2024, 310 million Chinese were over 60 years old. That's 22% of the entire population, up from 18% just 5 years ago. Within a decade, China will have 400 million senior citizens, more elderly people than the entire population of the United States, more retirees than workers in many regions. Who's going to support them? Remember the one-child policy? For decades, the government limited families to a single child. Now, China has what demographers call 4-to-1 families. 4 grandparents, 2 parents, all depending on one child. One person expected to financially support 6 while building their own career and family. It's mathematically impossible. It's emotionally devastating. The pension system is already cracking. In 2022, 14 provinces reported pension shortfalls. By 2035, analysts estimate China's pension system will need an additional $300 billion every single year just to stay solvent. That's more than China's entire military budget. And the pool of workers contributing to that system shrinks every year, while the pool of retirees demanding payouts explodes. The working-age population has been shrinking since 2012 and lost nearly 7 million workers in 2024 alone. That's like losing the entire workforce of a medium-sized European country every single year. Factory workers complain they can't hire enough hands. Pension administrators watch contribution pools evaporate. and retailers see fewer consumers walking through doors with money to spend. Meanwhile, marriages have collapsed to historic lows. In 2024, only 6.1 million couples got married, down from over 13 million just a decade ago. Divorces rose to 2.6 million. Fewer marriages mean fewer babies. Fewer babies mean fewer future workers. Fewer workers mean a dying economy supporting an exploding population of elderly dependents. And here's where those cold statistics meet real human despair. In August 2025, youth unemployment hit 18.9%, the highest since Beijing changed how they measure joblessness. Back in June 2023, the official rate hit a record 21.3%. Then, something remarkable happened. They stopped publishing the data entirely. The government claimed they needed to improve their statistical methodology. What they really needed was to hide numbers that made them look catastrophically incompetent. When they finally resumed publishing with their new, improved methodology that conveniently excludes students, the rate had magically dropped. Convenient timing. Independent estimates suggest the real unemployment rate for young Chinese might be closer to 25 or 30%. A generation of college students can't find work. Engineering students with advanced degrees are delivering food on electric scooters. Medical school graduates are driving rideshare. Law school graduates are selling insurance door to door. This year alone, 12.2 million new graduates entered the job market. 12 million young people looking for opportunities that don't exist, looking for careers that have evaporated, looking for a future their parents promised them. Take Liu Ming, a 24-year-old engineering graduate from a top Shanghai university. His parents spent their entire savings on his education, tutoring, exam prep, university fees, because they believed education was the ticket to a better life. Now he's been job hunting for 8 months. He delivers food on an electric scooter to pay rent, making barely enough to cover his share of a cramped apartment he splits with 3 other unemployed graduates. His parents' retirement fund? Gone. Their dreams of their son supporting them in old age? Shattered. This wasn't supposed to happen. The deal was simple. Study hard, get a degree, climb the corporate ladder, buy an apartment, start a family, retire comfortably. That was the formula, that was the path, that was the contract between generations. But the ladder is gone. The rungs have snapped, and millions of young Chinese are looking around, realizing the system they sacrificed their youth for has nothing to offer them. That's why they're lying flat. It's a movement that terrifies the Communist Party. Young Chinese refusing to chase careers that don't exist, refusing to buy homes they can't afford, refusing to have children they can't support, refusing to work overtime for bosses who will lay them off anyway, just opting out, lying flat, doing the absolute minimum to survive. Some call it let it rot, an acceptance that everything is broken, so why bother trying to fix it? The government hates it. State media runs endless propaganda about patriotism and hard work and sacrifice for the nation. Officials lecture young people about their duty to society. Universities are now required to teach courses on love education to encourage marriage and childbirth. But you can't motivate people with slogans when their reality is broken. You can't shame people into optimism when their prospects are garbage. Some aren't just lying flat, they're running. Immigration inquiries have surged to record levels. Wealthy Chinese are moving money to Singapore, buying property in Canada and Australia, sending their kids abroad with instructions never to return. They call it run philosophy. Escape while you still can. And it's not just the ultra-rich. Middle-class families are looking for any exit they can find. Student visa applications, investment immigration, marriage to foreigners, anything to get out before the doors close. So what happens when an entire generation gives up on the system their parents built? For 40 years, the Communist Party had a deal with the Chinese people, an unspoken contract written in rising living standards. Give up political freedom, no voting, no protests, no dissent, no questioning the party. And in return, we'll make you rich. We'll improve your life every year. Your children will do better than you did. Trust us. That deal is shattering. The property bubble didn't just destroy wealth, it destroyed faith. When your government promises stability and delivers collapse, when your safe investment evaporates overnight, when your children face worse prospects than you did despite working twice as hard, what exactly are you sacrificing your freedom for? Consumer confidence is cratered to historic lows. People aren't spending. They're hoarding cash, saving for disasters they can feel coming. The wealth effect has turned brutally negative. Everyone feels poorer, so everyone acts poorer, which makes everyone actually poorer, which makes everyone feel even worse. The middle class that was supposed to power China's future, it's shrinking. For the first time since economic reforms began in 1978, the Chinese middle class is contracting instead of expanding. The number of billionaires has been cut in half. Luxury spending has collapsed. Even basic consumption is stagnant. Xi Jinping's response? More control, more surveillance, more nationalism, more censorship. State media pumps out relentless propaganda about China's glorious rejuvenation and inevitable rise. Schools teach unquestioning loyalty to the party. Cameras with facial recognition watch every street corner. Social credit scores track every purchase, every movement, every association. Critics disappear into silence. Journalists vanish. Activists get re-educated. The message is clear. Endure the hardship for the glory of the nation. Accept the suffering as a necessary sacrifice. Trust the party to guide you through. But here's the thing about nationalism. You can't eat it. You can't pay rent with it. You can't save it for retirement or feed it to your children. When the economy is delivering prosperity, nationalism is a nice bonus. When the economy is failing, nationalism is a desperate distraction from a government that has nothing else to offer. And people are starting to notice. Not everyone is accepting this quietly. In late 2022, something unprecedented happened. Citizens took to the streets in Shanghai, Beijing, and other major cities. Not over wages or housing, but over COVID lockdowns that had strangled their lives for 3 years. Some held blank sheets of paper, a silent protest against censorship. Others chanted for freedom. A few even called for Xi Jinping to step down. The protests were crushed within days. Participants were tracked down, detained, re-educated. But for a brief moment, the facade cracked. The party saw what happens when enough people lose enough hope. They saw that beneath the enforced compliance, frustration runs deep. That memory haunts Beijing. It's why the surveillance has intensified. It's why the nationalism has gotten louder. Because they know the anger is still there, just waiting. This is how nations collapse. Not with invasions or revolutions or dramatic upheavals, but with a slow, grinding erosion of hope. One family at a time, watching their savings evaporate. One graduate at a time giving up on their dreams. One couple at a time deciding not to have children they can't afford. One elderly parent at a time realizing their one child can't support them. The property market won't recover because there aren't enough buyers. There aren't enough buyers because there aren't enough young people with money. There aren't enough young people because birth rates collapsed decades ago. And birth rates won't recover because young people can't afford to have kids, can't find stable jobs, can't see a future worth bringing children into. Every crisis feeds the next. It's a doom loop with no visible exit. China spent 40 years building the world's most impressive economic machine, gleaming cities that rose from rice paddies, bullet trains connecting metropolises, factories that supplied the entire planet. It was supposed to prove that authoritarianism could outperform democracy, that the future belonged to Beijing. Instead, it proved something darker. You can't build a miracle on debt, favorable demographics, and endless construction. But miracles don't last. The debt comes due, the demographics turn, the gleaming towers become monuments to hubris. What we're watching isn't a slowdown, it's not a rough patch, it's not a cycle that will correct itself with the right policies. It's a country that got old before it got rich, a country running out of workers, running out of buyers, running out of believers. A country where the young have stopped dreaming and the old have no one to care for them. China isn't just slowing down, it's collapsing back into what it once was. And here's the thing, China won't collapse alone. When the world's second largest economy tanks, everyone feels it. Those supply chains companies have spent decades building, they're being torn apart and rebuilt. That cheap stuff at every store, it's getting more expensive. Those treasury bonds China holds, they might need to sell them. The global economic order that emerged after 1990, it's being rewritten in real time. So, what do you think? Is there any path out of this spiral? Or is the Chinese miracle finally irreversibly over? Let us know in the comments. And if this opened your eyes to what's really happening behind the headlines, subscribe to Fall of Nations for more deep dives into the stories reshaping our world. Because this story isn't ending, it's just getting started.
Russia is running out of time. For years, Vladimir Putin has built an empire of smoke and mirrors, feeding his people the lie that Russia is untouchable. But behind the curtain, his war machine is devouring the country from the inside out. The cracks are no longer just showing, they're splitting wide open. The economy is unraveling. The Kremlin is throwing every last ruble into the war, gutting hospitals, schools, and social programs just to keep the fight going. The workforce is collapsing. Millions have fled, hundreds of thousands have died, and factories are running out of hands to keep up with the demand. The money is running dry. Experts warn that by the end of 2025, Russia could be out of liquid reserves entirely. And when that happens, the real crisis begins. Putin has two choices: scale back the war or watch Russia fall into the abyss. But the real question is, how much longer can he keep bluffing before everything crashes down? Let's break it all down. Bloomberg Economics predicts Russia's economic growth will grind to a near halt in 2025, barely scraping 1%, down from an estimated 3.1% in 2024. The International Monetary Fund isn't much more optimistic, projecting just 1.3% growth. And even if Putin miraculously pulled out of Ukraine tomorrow, the damage is already done. Russia's economy is running on fumes. A collapsing workforce, stalled productivity, and restricted access to global markets have left it with almost no room for recovery. Even the Kremlin's go-to economic crutch, military spending, can't prop things up like before. Yet, instead of trying to stop the bleeding, Putin is doubling down. In 2025, Russia's total government spending is set to rise to 41.5 trillion rubles, $421 billion, a 5% increase from the previous year. And guess where most of that money is going? War. Military and security spending will eat up over 43% of the budget, with national defense alone claiming a record-breaking 13.2 trillion rubles, $134 billion, a staggering 22.2% jump from 2024. This is now the single largest line item in Russia's budget, accounting for nearly a third of all government spending. And here's the kicker: 85% of that defense budget is classified, hidden, off the books. But it's not hard to guess where the money is going: feeding the war in Ukraine. To keep its war machine going, Russia has doubled armored vehicle production, ramped up ammunition output fivefold, and diverted almost all drone manufacturing toward military use, gutting civilian drone programs by 90%. Military pensions and housing alone will swallow 25% of the budget, about $17 billion. But all this military spending comes at a price, and Russia's civilians are the ones paying it. Spending on healthcare, education, and public services is taking a massive hit, with planned funding dropping by 16% compared to last year. And businesses, they're struggling to survive. Essentially, there's little money left for anything outside the war effort. Struggling industries, coal, automotive manufacturing, housing construction, and non-food retail are all begging for state support, but there's just not enough to go around. Public sector workers, teachers, doctors, law enforcement are feeling the squeeze. Their wages are tied to official inflation figures, which the government claims are under control. But in reality, inflation is running wild. Official data reports inflation at 9.5% in December 2024, up from 8.9% the previous month. But independent research tells a different story. Romir, a Russian independent research firm, reported that the prices of essential goods skyrocketed by 22% in September alone. The Kremlin's numbers simply don't match the reality Russians face every day, and things are only getting worse. With state spending ballooning, especially on defense, the demand for goods and services far outstrips what Russia's struggling industries can produce. This means higher reliance on imports, which drives up demand for foreign currency and, in turn, fuels inflation. The Central Bank of Russia has been forced to hold interest rates at a staggering 21%, one of the highest in the world, and yet it's barely making a dent in the inflation crisis. Even when adjusted for inflation, the real interest rate sits around 10%, an extraordinarily high figure by global standards. And this is just the start. Food prices are expected to spiral even further in 2025, making life even harder for ordinary Russians. With wages for public sector workers stuck in place, people are being crushed under the weight of soaring costs. But hey, who needs food when you got tanks, right? But inflation isn't Russia's only problem. It's also running out of workers. Putin's war has gutted the workforce. Hundreds of thousands have been sent to die at the front. Millions have fled, and the country's shrinking population isn't producing enough replacements. The result? A labor crisis that's hitting key industries, especially defense manufacturing, hard. Wages are skyrocketing, but it's not helping businesses. It's just making survival harder. In Kurgan, home to Russia's armored vehicle production, wages have shot up by 33%. The problem? There aren't enough workers left to even pay. Central Asian migrants could fill the gap if Russia wasn't so openly hostile toward them. Thanks to restrictive migration policies and widespread xenophobia, Moscow is effectively shutting out one of its only options for relief. Instead, the country is stuck with a labor shortage it can't fix, a workforce it can't grow, and wages it can't sustain. But even if Russia could find workers, how would it pay them? Because the real crisis is that the money is running out, fast. The war is bleeding Russian corporations dry, and the Kremlin is scrambling to keep the economy afloat. Its solution? Raiding the National Wealth Fund, NWF. But even that piggy bank is running dangerously low. The NWF has gone from $117 billion in 2021 to a meager $31 billion by the end of November 2024. If you take out the gold, that number drops even further. The days of Russia relying on this fund to cover its budget gaps are numbered. It certainly doesn't help that Russia is planning to spend over $130 billion on defense in 2025 alone. That's why experts predict that by the fall of 2025, Russia's liquid reserves will be completely depleted, which means budget cuts will be unavoidable. But that's not all. To keep the economy from fully collapsing, the Kremlin might be forced to revive Soviet-era practices like price controls and rationing. The Soviet sins are making a comeback, and it's a sign of just how desperate things have become. The rapid depletion of the NWF is partly thanks to Western sanctions that have prevented Russia from borrowing money abroad. Foreign debt has plummeted from $729 billion in 2023 to around $293 billion by September 2024, exacerbating the country's financial woes. In late November 2024, the ruble suffered a sharp drop, plunging nearly 25% from its 2022 highs. By November 27th, it had crashed to 114 per US dollar, less than a penny per ruble. After emergency interventions, the central bank managed to pull it back slightly, but the damage was done. Of course, sanctions played a major role here. When the U.S. blacklisted 50 Russian banks, including Gazprom Bank, a crucial player in Russia's currency markets, the ruble went into freefall. But that wasn't the only issue. The ruble also lost ground against the yuan, Russia's main alternative to Western currencies. Over the summer, Russian businesses and banks were already struggling to get enough yuan, a problem that only worsened as the ruble's decline made imports more expensive. Desperate to stop the bleeding, Moscow turned to familiar tactics: capital controls, foreign currency interventions, and sky-high interest rates. But these weren't magic fixes. The National Wealth Fund had already been drained to prop up the currency, leaving fewer resources for future bailouts. Interest rates were jacked up to 21% we just mentioned, squeezing businesses and consumers alike. And half of Russia's foreign exchange reserves remain frozen due to Western sanctions, limiting its ability to stabilize the currency. Sure, the ruble saw a brief rebound in early January 2025, clawing back to just under 100 per dollar. The finance ministry paused foreign currency purchases to ease pressure, and speculation about a potential Trump presidency fueled hopes of relaxed sanctions. But even with this temporary lifeline, the ruble remains in deep trouble. It simply doesn't have anything going for it. Foreign investments is non-existent, exports are constrained, and Moscow is running out of tools to keep its currency afloat. So it's blow after blow after blow, each one chipping away at Russia's ability to sustain its war machine. As the renowned Swedish economist Anders Aslund puts it, at the risk of a financial crash rises, Russia's imperiled economy is about to pose serious constraints on Putin's war. But how? How does a shrinking labor force weaken Russia's ability to fight? How do empty coffers limit its war spending? How does inflation, hitting ordinary Russians hardest, affect support for the war? And most importantly, how long can the Kremlin keep the war machine running before the cracks become impossible to ignore? Let's answer all these questions. Russia's war machine runs on weapons, that much is clear. But the factories making these weapons are stretched to the limit. Industrial facilities are already operating at 81% capacity, with 73% of enterprises facing labor shortages. This is more than just an economic headache, it's a logistical nightmare. The domestic economy simply can't keep up with the state's insatiable demand for arms. Of course, it doesn't help that battlefield losses are outpacing production. Simply put, Russia is burning through weapons faster than it can replace them, forcing the military to dip into aging Cold War stockpiles. If this trend continues, experts suggest that by late 2025, Russia could start running out of key military assets entirely. We already mentioned that the Russian citizens couldn't have both guns and butter, but as things are going, Putin might soon not have enough guns either. Another thing Putin will run out of: soldiers. Russia is bleeding troops at an unsustainable rate. Between February 24, 2022 and January 29, 2025, Moscow lost over 834,670 soldiers in Ukraine, according to the General Staff of Ukraine's Armed Forces. That's an astonishing figure that would cripple most armies. To compensate, Putin has ordered yet another expansion of Russia's military, raising the number of active servicemen to 1.5 million. But where is the money for this coming from? Expanding the army isn't just about numbers. It's also about funding, training, and equipment, all of which require a budget that Russia doesn't have. That's why military expert Dara Masakot questions whether the Kremlin can even afford this expansion while keeping weapons production somewhat afloat. Remember, the numbers don't lie. Putin has already ordered 3 troop increases since the invasion. First, he added 137,000, then another 170,000, then came the 300,000-man mobilization in 2022, which sent tens of thousands of draft-age men fleeing the country. Now he's promising the world's second-largest standing army, even though Russia can barely maintain the one it already has. The numbers might not lie, but Putin has no issue doing so. As always, the Kremlin is right behind Putin, insisting the Russian forces will rely on volunteers. But as economic conditions worsen and inflation erodes real wages, the appeal of military service shrinks, not grows. And without enough incentives, whether financial or ideological, how does Russia sustain this massive army? Throwing more bodies at the front isn't a strategy. It's a sign of desperation. Still, Putin has managed to hold the line this far by squeezing every last ounce of life out of his economy. But crucially, the Russian people have continued to support his war effort. According to a recent survey by the independent polling agency Levada, more than three-quarters of Russians are still backing the war effort, even as their economy falters. In fact, a growing minority of 39% of Russians even believe that using nuclear weapons could be justified in certain conditions. This reflects the degree to which the state has manipulated public perception to maintain this support. That support, however, is built on a fragile foundation. Putin can keep going for now because his control over the narrative and his suppression of dissent have kept public anger in check. But this won't last. The rising costs of war are simply too much for Russia to sustain indefinitely. Yes, Putin has made significant tax hikes and price increases a cornerstone of his strategy to keep the war machine churning. But this comes at a high cost. It's draining the pockets of regular Russians who can only tolerate so much before the pressure becomes unbearable. Inflation is pushing ordinary citizens to the brink, while the military losses and endless mobilization are adding fuel to the fire. For now, fear is still stronger than frustration. However, this dynamic will eventually shift. The same inflation, loss of life, and economic collapse that Putin can ignore today will bite harder tomorrow. The ultimate collapse of Russia's economy isn't a question of if, it's a matter of when. Once the Russian public reaches its boiling point, the entire structure of Putin's war machine will unravel. But don't expect this unraveling to happen in 2025. Alexandra Prokopenko of the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center explains why. The economy may struggle, but it's not yet bad enough to force an immediate end to the war. In the short term, Russia still has enough resources to sustain its campaign in Ukraine, perhaps in part because it's playing a dangerous waiting game, hoping that Western resolve weakens before it's too late. But beyond 2025, the writing is on the wall. Rising inequality, a decline in quality of life, and the constant strain of war will start to fray the social contract. Vasily Astrov, a senior economist at the Vienna Institute, has warned of a wave of bankruptcies which could send the country into a tailspin if left unchecked. As for the long-term consequences, Russia is likely heading toward an economic trap. The model it's currently running on, driven by military spending, rampant inflation, and reliance on a shrinking workforce, will only worsen as time goes on. Though a dramatic collapse akin to the 1990s might not be in the cards, the country is undoubtedly headed toward a slow, grinding stagnation. It may not be the sudden burst of collapse, but the unavoidable decay will wear down the country's ability to maintain its war effort. In a few years, when Russia can no longer fund its military adventures or even keep its domestic economy from sliding into further chaos, the war in Ukraine may very well become the tipping point that brings Putin's entire regime down. Now, we know that in a few years isn't exactly the hopeful timeline many are wishing for. The hard truth is, it might take longer than some would like to see Russia's collapse fully unfold. However, it's also worth noting that the West, spearheaded by the U.S., could speed up this long-awaited collapse. The most immediate and impactful approach is to increase economic pressure, particularly targeting Russia's oil revenue, which remains a lifeline for Putin's war effort. Currently, Russia produces about 10% of the world's oil, which makes oil a significant source of funding for its military operations. In 2025, oil and gas revenues are projected to fall by around 3%, but even this modest decline will be painful for Russia if it's exacerbated by external pressure. The U.S. can use a combination of measures to disrupt Russia's ability to profit from oil sales, including sanctions on its shadow fleet of tankers that help Moscow evade oil price caps. As it stands, Western sanctions have already begun to cripple Russia's oil exports, but much more can be done. The Biden administration was well aware of this fact, so one of its last actions was to impose sanctions on over 150 individual vessels in this fleet. These sanctions are a direct hit to Russia's ability to transport oil, driving up cost and reducing revenue. But beyond targeting Russia's fleet, there's a pressing need to focus on key buyers of Russian crude, particularly in China, India, and Turkey. These nations continue to purchase Russian oil and refine it into products that are subsequently sold worldwide, funneling critical funds to Russia. By threatening to sanction these countries or their refineries if they continue to buy Russian oil, the U.S. could force them to reconsider their transactions, If these countries can no longer refine Russian oil, Russia's ability to profit from its energy exports will take a severe blow. One key economic indicator that has been fueling Putin's war machine is the global oil price. If Western nations, led by the U.S., significantly ramp up their oil production, as Trump has proposed, the global supply would increase, potentially driving down oil prices. With less revenue from oil, Russia would find it even harder to sustain its military expenditures. While this is a longer-term strategy, increasing production could substantially weaken Russia's ability to fund its war effort, providing another economic lever for the West to pull. At the same time, the U.S. and its allies can also ramp up sanctions that target Russia's financial and technological infrastructure. By further isolating Russian banks from the global financial system and limiting their access to advanced technologies, the West could create bottlenecks that slow down Russia's war machine. For example, tightening restrictions on high-tech exports, especially those related to defense and energy sectors, would leave Russia unable to maintain or develop the tools needed for both war and economic recovery. Despite potential challenges that come with these moves, many experts believe that the time for more decisive action is now. The longer the West waits, the longer Russia's war effort will persist, and the longer Putin will pretend that Russia's economy is thriving. For now, he's playing the poker game of his life, bluffing his way through an economic crisis while hoping the West buys the story. But even a seasoned player can't keep up a bluff forever. The cracks are simply widening too much. And while Putin's rhetoric might sound like a steady hand on the wheel, the truth is that he's starting to panic. As Reuters exclusively reported, Putin is increasingly worried about the distortions in Russia's wartime economy we covered in this video: labor shortages, rising inflation, and an unsustainable military budget. This worry extends into the Kremlin, where many officials are starting to see a negotiated end to the war as necessary. But here's where the problem lies. Putin doesn't want a deal. His stance has been clear from the start. He isn't looking for a face-saving settlement. The only deal he's ever been willing to entertain is the total collapse of Ukraine. After investing so much, over 830,000 soldiers and trillions of dollars, why would he settle for anything less than victory? Anything short of complete success would be an unacceptable loss for him. The only way to reach a deal is to back Putin into a corner. But do you think Russia's crumbling economy or its frustrated citizens have the power to make that happen? And if so, how much longer can Russia hold on? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into global politics and military analysis. The border between North and South Korea, December 12, 2025, 4:30 a.m. A single gunshot rings out across the DMZ, the world's most heavily fortified border. But this isn't a random act of aggression. It's the first move in what intelligence agencies have dubbed Operation Fallen Star. Behind the scenes, 3 distinct strategies have been meticulously planned to dismantle the Kim regime, each with its own shocking consequences. For decades, North Korea has stood as a defiant nuclear-armed threat, outlasting every attempt to bring it to heel. But the world has run out of patience. What you're about to discover are the 3 most viable options to take down North Korea, methods that could finally end the Kim dynasty's reign of terror. But here's what's truly terrifying. One of these methods is already being implemented as we speak. The question isn't if North Korea will fall, it's how. And which option would cause the least bloodshed while preventing a nuclear catastrophe that could kill millions? Let's break it down. For decades, North Koreans have been told they live in a socialist paradise, while the rest of the world suffers in capitalist hell. But that narrative is cracking. Through USB drives smuggled across the Chinese border, radio broadcasts penetrating their airwaves, and balloons carrying leaflets from the south, North Koreans are increasingly exposed to the reality beyond their borders. And that reality is devastating their belief system. You might think a few TV shows and some pamphlets couldn't topple a nuclear-armed dictatorship, but that underestimates just how fragile the North Korean propaganda machine really is. The entire Kim dynasty's rule has been built on a foundation of lies, that the Kims are godlike figures, that North Korea won the Korean War, that citizens are better off than their southern neighbors. Once those lies are exposed, the regime's grip on power begins to weaken. Since 2009, millions of USB drives and micro SD cards have been smuggled into North Korea, according to groups tracking cross-border information flow. That's one for every few citizens, creating invisible networks of resistance across the country. These drives aren't just entertainment, they're weapons of mass revelation. The method is shockingly effective. As human rights activists explain, North Korean defectors consistently report that exposure to outside information was a key factor in their decision to escape. The psychological impact is devastating the regime's control in ways missiles never could. What makes these drives so potent is how they're distributed. Rather than dropping them from drones or balloons, most enter through sophisticated smuggling networks operating along the Chinese border. Technology smugglers risk torture at the hands of North Korean authorities, but continue their dangerous missions. One distributor was reportedly executed after delivering 500 flash drives, yet the flow of information continues. The weapons of this information war grow more sophisticated every year. Since 2010, access to USB flash drives and foreign media in North Korea has surged. Despite harsh penalties, including the risk of execution, over 83% of escapees between 2016 and 2020 reported consuming foreign music, TV shows, or films before they fled. The regime understands this threat all too well. Kim Jong-un has implemented some of the world's harshest penalties for citizens caught with foreign media. People found in possession of South Korean dramas or American movies face public trials, with punishments ranging from years in labor camps to execution. Yet, despite these draconian measures, the black market for foreign media thrives. Each drive costs North Koreans the equivalent of a week's wages, yet demand remains insatiable. The goal is to flood the market with outside information, making it cheap and accessible enough that anyone who wants it can get it. And it's working. The Flash Drives for Freedom campaign, supported by the Human Rights Foundation, has collected hundreds of thousands of donated USB drives from around the world. These are wiped clean, loaded with curated content, and smuggled into North Korea through various covert channels. But it's not just USB drives. Balloon launches from South Korea have been another key tactic in the information war. Organizations like Park Sang-hak's Fighters for a Free North Korea regularly send balloons carrying bundles of DVDs, USBs, transistor radios, and leaflets printed with information about the outside world. Each balloon carries a timer that breaks open the packages over North Korean territory, showering the countryside with forbidden knowledge. The impact of these campaigns is difficult to measure precisely, but testimonies from defectors paint a compelling picture. Many report that their first exposure to South Korean dramas or Hollywood movies was a transformative experience that challenged everything they had been taught about the outside world. The sight of ordinary South Koreans driving cars, using uncensored internet, and enjoying well-stocked supermarkets directly contradicts decades of propaganda claiming South Koreans live in desperate poverty. This cognitive dissonance is a powerful catalyst for change. When North Koreans see the material prosperity and personal freedoms enjoyed by their southern counterparts, they begin to question other aspects of the regime's narrative. If the government lied about conditions in South Korea, what else might they be lying about? The strategic value of this approach is that it attacks the regime from within. Unlike military options that strengthen the regime by creating an external threat, information warfare turns citizens themselves into agents of change. When people discover they've been lied to their entire lives, revolution becomes inevitable. This approach also has strong historical precedent. Flash Drives for Freedom reports that, like East Germans in 1989, North Koreans are increasingly asking, why should we stay separated by minefields and guard towers from a vastly wealthier and freer version of ourselves? The evidence of impact is mounting. Defection rates have soared among those exposed to outside information, and black markets selling foreign goods operate more openly than ever. Even the regime's own propaganda has shifted, desperately trying to explain away the obvious prosperity visible in smuggled South Korean dramas. Technology is making this information war even more difficult for the regime to combat. Chinese-made devices called Notels Portable media players equipped with USB and SD card ports have become increasingly common in North Korea. These battery-powered players allow North Koreans to watch foreign content even during the frequent power outages that plague the country. Some even feature built-in radio receivers capable of picking up South Korean and Chinese broadcasts. The regime's control over information is further weakened by the growing prevalence of smartphones and tablets within North Korea. While the network connectivity of these devices is strictly limited, they come with one crucial feature that information activists can exploit: USB ports. This technological evolution represents a significant challenge to the regime's information monopoly. But like all strategic options, information warfare has one critical flaw: time. While psychological operations can erode the regime's foundations, the process could take years, even decades, to fully collapse the government. And with Kim Jong-un furiously developing his nuclear arsenal, the world may not have that luxury. If you're thinking we need something more immediate, you're right. But what comes next might shock you, because it involves a strategy that's been attempted at least 12 times already and failed every time. The second strategy for taking down North Korea is as ancient as politics itself: assassination. Eliminate Kim Jong-un and possibly other key leaders through covert action, and you potentially destroy the command structure of the entire regime. It seems straightforward enough: one precision strike and the nightmare ends. But if it were that simple, someone would have succeeded by now. Since taking power in 2011, Kim Jong-un has survived multiple assassination attempts. The most recent attempt in 2024 reportedly came within 400 meters of success, yet the supreme leader remains firmly in control. The challenges of assassination are extraordinary. First, there's the problem of access. Kim travels at dawn, constantly changes his schedule, uses decoy vehicles, and is surrounded by fanatically loyal bodyguards in a country that's over 120,000 square kilometers, with mountains making up nearly 80% of its surface. His movements are so secretive that even high-ranking officials often don't know his whereabouts. The consequences of a failed attempt would be catastrophic. In 2017, North Korea accused the CIA and South Korean intelligence of planning to use a biochemical weapon against Kim, vowing to ferret out and mercilessly destroy those responsible. Even an unsuccessful attempt could trigger a massive military response against South Korea or Japan. But even if an assassin did manage to eliminate Kim Jong-un, would that really solve the problem? Here's where things get complicated. Intelligence agencies believe Kim Jong-un has put a kill order on his half-brother's head, with the assassination of Kim Jong-nam in 2017 serving as a chilling example of the regime's ruthlessness. The killing took place in broad daylight at Malaysia's Kuala Lumpur International Airport using VX nerve agent, one of the deadliest chemical weapons on Earth. The assassination was expertly planned, with two women approaching Kim Jong-nam and swabbing his face with the VX nerve agent as he waited for a flight to Macau. He died just 15 to 20 minutes later while being transported to the hospital. The brazen nature of this killing reveals the regime's capabilities and willingness to conduct lethal operations far beyond North Korea's borders. The women who carried out the attack, Siti Aisyah from Indonesia and Joan Chi Huang from Vietnam, claimed they had been tricked into participating, believing they were taking part in a prank show. Both were initially charged with murder, though the charges were later dropped when investigators determined they had indeed been unwitting pawns in the plot. 4 North Korean suspects, later confirmed to be spies, fled the country immediately after the assassination. Kim Jong-nam's killing demonstrates both the regime's effectiveness at eliminating threats and its complete disregard for international norms. The use of a banned chemical weapon in a public international airport shows a level of audacity that few other regimes would contemplate. But Kim's personal security makes any assassination attempt against him nearly impossible. North Korea's security apparatus is designed to protect the Kim family at all costs, with domestic intelligence and security agencies aided by the cultivation of a Kim personality cult. Any attempt on his life would face multiple layers of defense, from bodyguards to electronic countermeasures to an elaborate system of tunnels and bunkers. The protection of the Kim dynasty has been a priority since the days of Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea and grandfather of the current leader. According to North Korean propaganda, Kim Il-sung was saved from an assassination attempt by his first wife, Kim Jong-suk, who spotted enemy soldiers taking aim at him from a nearby field and eliminated them with her Mauser rifle. While this tale is likely exaggerated, it has served as a propaganda parable about the need for absolute devotion to the security of the Kims. Even more concerning is that Kim Jong-un appears to have learned from historical assassination attempts. Since coming to power, he has purged numerous officials suspected of disloyalty, including his uncle, Jang Song-thaek, who was executed in 2013. These purges have eliminated potential internal threats while sending a clear message to anyone who might consider turning against the regime. Even if an assassination were successful, it could trigger something far worse, the dead man's switch problem. North Korea passed a law stating that if Kim is killed, tactical nuclear weapons would be automatically deployed against South Korea, Japan, and potentially U.S. bases in the region. His death could unleash precisely the catastrophe the assassination was meant to prevent, and there's no guarantee his successor would be any better. His sister, Kim Yo-jong, is reportedly even more hardline than her brother. Some intelligence analysts believe she was behind the bombing of the Inter-Korean Liaison Office in 2020. Replacing Kim with his sister might only accelerate the regime's aggression. What if, instead of targeting just Kim, the assassination were expanded to include the entire leadership structure? North Korea has a long history of assassinations and attempts, both carrying them out and being targeted. In 1968, a team of 31 North Korean commandos was dispatched to South Korea with the mission of killing President Park Chung-hee. The attempt failed, but it demonstrates the complexity and high stakes of such operations. The ideal scenario would involve eliminating not just Kim, but the entire top echelon of leadership simultaneously, creating enough chaos to prevent a coherent nuclear response while opening space for reformers within the system. South Korean intelligence has identified at least 7 potential reform-minded officials who could step forward in such a scenario, individuals who have privately expressed frustration with Kim's policies. But coordinating such a massive operation would be nearly impossible without insider help. Another challenge is that much of North Korea's leadership spends significant time in hardened underground bunkers and facilities, designed specifically to protect them from assassination attempts. These deeply buried facilities provide security not just from conventional attacks, but also from more sophisticated methods like precision airstrikes or special operations raids. Historically, several attempts to train units specifically for assassination missions against North Korean leadership have ended in failure. In one notable case, South Korean forces trained a special unit on Silmido Island to infiltrate North Korea and assassinate Kim Il-sung. The operation ended disastrously when the recruits rebelled against their handlers, killing 18 guards and hijacking a bus to Seoul, where they died in a final confrontation with police. And yet, despite these risks and historical failures, assassination remains on the table because it offers something the information warfare approach doesn't: speed. In a matter of hours, the entire leadership structure could change. But if you think assassination is risky, wait until you hear about the third option, the approach that military planners consider the absolute last resort, but also the most definitive solution. It begins with a deafening barrage from the sea. Tomahawk cruise missiles streak across the pre-dawn sky, targeting North Korean nuclear facilities, command centers, and artillery positions along the DMZ. Within minutes, stealth fighters penetrate North Korean airspace, clearing the way for waves of bombers. The most dangerous option for taking down North Korea is also the most straightforward: full-scale military invasion. But the cost would be catastrophic. Even before the first American or South Korean boot touches North Korean soil, the regime would almost certainly unleash its arsenal against Seoul, a city of 10 million people just 35 miles from the border. While earlier estimates suggested North Korea could turn Seoul into a sea of fire with massive casualties, recent analysis presents a more nuanced picture. According to a 2020 RAND Corporation study, North Korea maintains nearly 5,700 artillery systems within range of major South Korean population centers. Of these, only a few hundred long-range artillery pieces and multiple launch rocket systems can actually reach Seoul from their positions along the DMZ. The most dangerous systems include 170mm self-propelled guns and 240mm multiple launch rocket systems, with the newer 300mm MRLs presenting an even greater threat. In a worst-case scenario, casualties from artillery strikes could range from about 4,500 to more than 200,000, depending on the scale and duration of the bombardment and how many people are in shelters. The numbers are staggering. The U.S. Department of Defense assessed that a second Korean War could produce 200,000 to 300,000 South Korean and U.S. military casualties within the first 90 days, in addition to hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths. What makes a military invasion truly terrifying isn't just the initial casualties, it's the potential for rapid escalation. According to the Federation of American Scientists, as of 2024, North Korea is estimated to have approximately 50 nuclear weapons, with the ability to produce enough fissile material for 6 to 7 additional nuclear weapons per year. While there's significant uncertainty about the exact size of their nuclear arsenal, experts assess that North Korea has developed warheads small enough to be mounted on both short-range and intercontinental ballistic missiles. The sheer scale of such an operation would be unlike anything since World War II. A South Korean military white paper estimated that U.S. would need to deploy 690,000 ground troops if war broke out, far more than the peak numbers in either Iraq or Afghanistan. Other experts suggest at least 200,000 troops would be needed, along with 2,000 aircraft and a massive naval presence. The logistical challenges alone are daunting. While air transport can quickly move 100 troops at a time, the bulk of U.S. forces and equipment would need to come by sea, a process that could take 6 weeks or longer. During this build-up period, North Korea would have ample time to prepare its defenses and possibly launch preemptive strikes. And we haven't even accounted for China's response. Would Beijing sit idle as U.S. forces approach its border? Historical precedent from the Korean War suggests otherwise, when Chinese forces intervened to prevent North Korea's collapse. A new Korean conflict could quickly escalate into a superpower confrontation. In 2017, the Pentagon assessed that a ground invasion would be the only way to locate and secure all of North Korea's nuclear weapons, stating in an official letter to Congress that the action could result in hundreds of thousands or even millions of deaths in just the first few days of fighting. But there's another factor that makes a military invasion of North Korea uniquely challenging: the country's vast network of underground facilities. North Korea is honeycombed with tunnels, anywhere from 5,000 to 8,000 underground sites, according to U.S. military estimates. These aren't just simple bunkers. They include elaborate underground complexes housing everything from leadership hideouts to missile launch facilities and even entire military bases. The underground labyrinth includes facilities like the one at Suncheon, where a 4,400-foot taxiway extends from an underground facility to open terrain. Analysts believe this could function as an auxiliary runway, allowing aircraft to be readied in concealment and launch with little or no warning. One North Korean defector revealed that fighter jets, including MiG-29s and Su-25 ground attack aircraft, could take off from conventional airfields but return to these underground bases during wartime. Near the DMZ, North Korea has constructed massive bunker complexes capable of housing up to 2,000 fully armed troops each. These underground facilities would allow North Korean forces to remain hidden and protected until the moment of attack, potentially enabling a surprise assault across the border with minimal warning. Even more concerning are the tunnels that cross under the DMZ itself. Since 1974, South Korea has discovered at least 4 infiltration tunnels large enough to move up to 30,000 troops per hour. Some experts believe there could be dozens more undiscovered tunnels. A former South Korean general claims there may be as many as 84 tunnels, with some potentially reaching as far as downtown Seoul. The regime has also constructed a network of hardened artillery sites, or HARTs, artillery concealing caves tunneled into mountains near the DMZ. Artillery pieces such as 170mm Coxswain guns or multiple rocket launchers can fire from the cave entrances and then withdraw into the mountains to reload, making them nearly impossible to destroy with counter-battery fire. These subterranean advantages make North Korea a uniquely difficult military target. As one military analyst put it, these fortifications could not only enhance the Korean People's Army's ability to mount a surprise attack, but also to prolong the war, confounding the high-tech armed forces of its adversaries. The Pentagon has been actively preparing for this underground challenge. In March 2025, U.S. and South Korean forces conducted joint military exercises specifically focused on underground warfare, deploying reconnaissance drones and robotic dogs to infiltrate and secure underground tunnel networks. The drills focused on eliminating enemy positions outside tunnels, securing entry points, and disabling utilities like water, ventilation, and electricity to trap enemy forces inside. Despite these horrific projections and extraordinary challenges, military planners continue to refine invasion plans because, unlike the other options, a full-scale military campaign offers definitive results. The primary objective of a North Korean invasion would be to seize Seoul and hold it as long as possible while inflicting maximum damage on South Korean infrastructure. Countering this requires overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. The strategy would unfold in phases. First, a massive preemptive strike against nuclear and artillery sites, then rapid ground invasion from multiple directions with the goal of reaching Pyongyang before the regime could fully respond. Special forces would simultaneously target key leadership and attempt to secure nuclear sites. The RAND Corporation has analyzed three major security challenges on the Korean peninsula: a large, survivable North Korean nuclear force, North Korean artillery threatening Seoul, and the potential mission to secure loose nuclear weapons after regime collapse. All three scenarios present extraordinarily difficult military challenges, especially when combined. What's most disturbing is how unprepared the public is for the reality of such a conflict. As one retired U.S. Air Force general put it, too many people have the view that it would be like the invasion of Iraq or Afghanistan, but it wouldn't be remotely that. But here's the twist that few outside military planning circles understand. What makes a military option viable isn't the invasion itself, but the credible threat of one. By maintaining the capability and apparent willingness to invade, the U.S. and its allies create leverage for diplomatic and covert approaches. So, which of these three methods would actually work? The answer is complicated and perhaps surprising. None of them would work in isolation, but together they form a comprehensive strategy that might actually succeed. Information warfare creates internal pressure and weakens regime legitimacy. The threat of assassination forces Kim to focus inward on security rather than outward aggression. And the looming possibility of invasion provides the ultimate motivation for both North Korea and China to consider alternatives. This is the strategy that appears to be unfolding right now, a coordinated pressure campaign using all three approaches simultaneously. Recent satellite imagery shows increased balloon launches from South Korea carrying information packages. U.S. naval forces have conducted 14 exercises in nearby waters over the past 6 months, and intelligence sources report at least 3 high-level North Korean officials having defected with their families. The situation is tightening around the North Korean regime, but the most shocking development is something few outside intelligence circles have noticed: China's quiet pivot. After decades of propping up the North Korean regime, Beijing is pulling back. Trade levels haven't returned to pre-pandemic norms, and public support for Pyongyang's military provocations has noticeably faded. China is still North Korea's biggest trading partner, but its silence now speaks volumes. The world's approach to North Korea is changing, and that might be what finally brings this regime to its knees. So, what do you think? Would information warfare eventually succeed without the risks of more aggressive approaches? Is assassination justified if it prevents nuclear war? Or is military action inevitable despite its horrific cost? The decisions made in the next few years could determine whether the Korean peninsula faces devastating war or peaceful reunification. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Now go watch North Korea Will Be Erased from the Map. Demographics Crisis Explained. And if you're into sharp geopolitical insights, strategy breakdowns, and a bit of global chaos, hit that subscribe button and join the Fall of Nations community. They built an empire of lies, and now it's all falling apart. 20 years ago, China promised the world it would become the next great superpower. Massive GDP growth, gleaming megacities, technological dominance, the works. But here's what they didn't tell you. It was all fake. The growth numbers? Manipulated. The cities? Ghost towns. The economic miracle? Built on a mountain of debt that's about to bury them alive. Empire of lies. That's what China really built. And we're about to expose every single deception. Right now, as you watch this, China's youth unemployment is so bad they stopped publishing the real numbers. Their property market, worth more than the entire U.S. economy, is imploding. Major cities are going bankrupt, and the government is so desperate they're literally buying empty apartments just to hide the crisis. This isn't just China's problem. When an $18.7 trillion economy built on lies starts collapsing, everyone feels it. You think you know the story of China's rise? You don't know anything yet. What we're about to show you will completely change how you see the world's supposed next superpower. The empire of lies is crumbling, and the truth is more shocking than anyone imagined. Let's start with the biggest lie of all, China's economic growth. Beijing claims they hit exactly 5% GDP growth in 2024. Exactly 5%. What are the odds of hitting a round number like that in a real economy? 0. The Rhodium Group estimates the real growth was around 2.4 to 2.8%. China had to lie about nearly half their economic performance just to look respectable. Here's the smoking gun. While reporting this strong growth, China was simultaneously cutting interest rates, launching emergency stimulus, and creating new ways to prop up their stock market. Even China doesn't believe their own numbers. And that 2.4% to 2.8% growth came at a staggering cost. China had to invest 40% of their entire economy to achieve it. The U.S. invests about 20%. China burns $40 to generate $100 of activity. That's not growth. That's economic arson. China's nominal GDP, the number that actually matters for real wages and government budgets, grew by only 4.2% in 2024. That's the slowest rate on record outside of the pandemic years. When your nominal growth is slower than your real growth, you've got serious problems. China's GDP deflator turned negative in 2024, and producer prices stayed in deflation, while headline inflation was barely plus 0.2%. The manufacturing sector tells an even uglier story. Remember when China was the world's factory floor? Those days are ending fast. In 2023 alone, foreign companies announced 378 major factory relocations out of China. Apple moved iPhone production to India. Samsung fled to Vietnam. Even Chinese companies like BYD are building factories in Mexico and Thailand. Why? Because Chinese workers aren't cheap anymore. Factory wages have tripled in the last decade. A worker in Vietnam costs half as much as one in China. In India, it's even less. But here's the kicker. China's workforce is shrinking. They've lost more than 41 million working-age people since 2020, and it's getting worse every year. But here's what reveals just how deep the deception goes. Those high-tech industries China keeps bragging about, they're tiny compared to their overall economy. Despite all the hype about becoming a tech superpower, high-tech manufacturing represents about 15% of industrial output. Meanwhile, traditional heavy industries are massively overbuilt and losing money. China's solution? Dump excess production on global markets at below-cost prices. That's not sustainable growth. That's economic warfare, and it's why countries are slapping tariffs on Chinese goods. The empire of lies convinced the world that China's rise was inevitable. But when your economy only grows through massive debt, when your workforce is aging out, and when factories are fleeing to cheaper countries, that's not a superpower in the making. That's a bubble about to burst. And speaking of bubbles, wait until you see what's happening to China's population, because the demographic disaster unfolding right now makes their economic lies look like small change. Here's a number that should terrify Beijing. China lost 1.39 million people in 2024. That's the third straight year of population decline. But the real horror story is in the details. China's birth rate has collapsed to just 1.0 children per woman in 2024. To put that in perspective, you need 2.1 children per woman just to maintain a stable population. China isn't even close. They're not just below replacement level, they're in demographic freefall. And it's accelerating. Marriages have plunged dramatically over the last decade. When people aren't getting married, they're not having kids. When they're not having kids, your entire civilization starts to die. The numbers are staggering. By 2035, just 10 years from now, 1 in 3 Chinese people will be over 60. That's more than 400 million elderly people who need pensions, health care, and support. For comparison, that's more senior citizens than the entire population of the United States. But here's where the empire of lies really crumbles. Who's going to support all these elderly people? China's typical family structure looks like this: 4 grandparents, 2 parents, and 1 child. They call them 4-2-1 families. That 1 child is supposed to support 6 older people. It's mathematically impossible. The working age population has already peaked and is now shrinking by 3 million people every year. By 2050, China will have twice as many people outside the working age as inside it. And the young people who are supposed to be China's future, they're giving up. Youth unemployment is so bad that China literally stopped publishing the numbers. When they resumed with the new methodology in December 2023, they somehow claimed unemployment had magically dropped from over 21% to under 15%. Right. What they actually did was change the definition to exclude students, rural, unemployed, and people who'd given up looking for work. Independent estimates put real youth unemployment closer to 30%. That's 1 in 3 young Chinese people without work. Meet the lying flat generation. Young Chinese who've completely opted out of the rat race. They refuse to work overtime, refuse to buy homes, refuse to get married, refuse to have children. Some are literally retiring to rural areas to escape the economic pressure. It's a massive rejection of everything the Chinese system promised them, and it's spreading. The number of Chinese applying to emigrate hit record highs in 2024. The wealthy are sending their kids abroad and moving their money with them. China isn't just losing people, it's losing its best and brightest. Here's the brutal truth: demographics is destiny, and China's destiny is to grow old before it grows rich. But there's an even more sinister aspect to China's demographic lies: the gender imbalance. Thanks to the one-child policy and cultural preferences for male children, China now has 30 million more men than women. They call them bare branches, men with no hope of continuing their family line. And they're angry. China tried to fix the birth rate with cash incentives. Some provinces pay up to $1,400 per child. They've made fertility treatments free. None of it is working. Here's why. Nearly 36,000 kindergartens closed in just 2 years. Elementary schools are shutting down by the thousands. When young people can barely afford to support themselves, having children becomes impossible. The empire built on lies told its people that prosperity was guaranteed. But when your birth rate collapses, your workforce shrinks, and your young people give up on the future, that's not the foundation of a superpower. That's the foundation of a civilization in decline. But you haven't seen the worst part yet, because what's happening to China's property market isn't just an economic crisis, it's the complete destruction of middle-class wealth on a scale that has never been seen before. China's real estate market is worth $50 trillion, more than the entire U.S. economy, and it's all coming down. They built enough empty apartments to house multiple times China's population. Surveys estimate around 65 million vacant units. That's 21% of all homes in China. For perspective, the entire U.S. has 140 million housing units total. Chinese families have 70% of their wealth tied up in real estate. When property values collapse, they lose everything. And collapse they have. Prices dropped 30% in some cities. Remember Evergrande? Defaulted on $300 billion. Country Garden? $187 billion. Together, Chinese developers owe more than France's entire GDP. Here's the evil part. Developers sold 20 million apartments before building them, using new buyer money to finish old projects. Now, construction has stopped forever on millions of pre-sold homes. Take Zhang Wei from Shenzhen. In 2020, he spent $400,000 on an apartment. Today, it's worth half that. His life savings gone. Local governments funded themselves by selling land to developers. With property frozen, cities are cutting salaries 50%. Some can't afford streetlights. Tianjin is literally selling government buildings. They can't afford their own offices. The smoking gun? Local governments have $9 trillion in hidden debt through special financing vehicles. That's bigger than Japan and Germany's economies combined. These vehicles are now defaulting. Instead of fixing the crisis, China's doubling down on deception. State companies are buying empty apartments to hide oversupply. They're arresting economists who publish negative data. When your solution to bad news is jailing messengers, you're not running an economy, you're running a cult. But there's an even darker layer to this crisis: the mortgage boycott movement we just mentioned. What started as isolated protests became a nationwide rebellion against the property system. Banks are now sitting on trillions in bad loans they can't acknowledge without triggering a financial meltdown. Some estimates suggest up to 40% of bank assets are tied to real estate in some form. When the property market dies, the banking system dies with it. Regional banks are already quietly failing. Small banks in Tier 3 cities have stopped making new loans entirely. The government response? Merge failing banks with healthier ones and hope nobody notices. Remember those ghost cities we mentioned? They're not just empty, they're actively deteriorating. Buildings constructed with substandard materials are literally crumbling before anyone ever lived in them. China built a $1 trillion mirage that's now turning to dust. And remember, this was supposed to be the foundation of China's middle class, the pathway to prosperity, the proof that the Chinese system worked. Instead, it's revealed as the biggest wealth destruction event in modern history. The Empire of Lies promised its people that real estate was a guaranteed path to riches. But when you build an entire economy on empty apartments and fabricated demand, the only guarantee is collapse. But if you think the property crisis is bad, wait until you see what's happening to China's social fabric. Because a generation of young Chinese isn't just losing money, they're losing hope. China had a deal with its people: give up political freedom, get economic prosperity. For 40 years, it worked. Now that social contract is crumbling. The jobless generation we mentioned, they're not just unemployed, they're completely checking out. Marriage rates plunged 60% in the last decade. Consumer spending has stagnated. Young people aren't just worried about the future, they're giving up on it. The brain drain is accelerating. Immigration applications hit record highs in 2024. The wealthy are fleeing with their money. China is losing human capital it can't replace. Xi Jinping's response? Double down on control. More surveillance, more censorship, more nationalism. He's trying to replace the economic dream with the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. But you can't eat nationalism. The regime is so desperate they're censoring economists who tell inconvenient truths. This isn't confident superpower behavior. This is a government that knows its foundational promises are exposed as lies. And that brings us to perhaps the biggest lie of all: China's supposed military strength and global influence. But before we expose China's military mirage, we need to talk about the man who accelerated China's decline, Xi Jinping. Remember how China used to work? Local officials had freedom to experiment, foreign investors were welcome, private business thrived. This system wasn't perfect, but it turned China into an economic powerhouse. Xi changed everything. Since taking power in 2012, he's rewired China's entire economy around one principle: his personal control. Take Jack Ma, founder of Alibaba. One speech criticizing financial regulators got his company's IPO canceled, triggered investigations, and made him disappear for months. Alibaba lost $400 billion in value because one businessman spoke out of turn. But Jack Ma wasn't the only casualty. Tech entrepreneur and actress Zhao Wei, once worth billions, saw her empire dismantled overnight after regulators decided she had too much influence. Real estate mogul Wang Jinlin was forced to sell off overseas assets and retreat from global expansion. The message was clear: no one gets bigger than Xi. Xi's anti-espionage law made basic market research potentially criminal. On a balance of payments basis, net foreign direct investment crashed 82% in 2023 to just $33 billion, the lowest since 1993. Businesses would rather abandon the world's biggest market than deal with this paranoia. Here's the devastating irony. Xi claimed these crackdowns would make China stronger by reducing chaos and disorder. Instead, they've killed the entrepreneurial spirit that made China's rise possible. Silicon Valley executives who once flocked to Beijing now avoid China entirely. Global companies are de-risking their supply chains to reduce dependence on Chinese manufacturing. Even Chinese entrepreneurs are moving their operations overseas. Local officials are now so terrified of making mistakes that they won't make decisions at all. When fear replaces expertise, you don't get growth, you get systemic destruction. Xi Jinping promised to make China great again. Instead, he's become the chief architect of China's decline, the man who killed the Chinese dream with his own hands. The leader who promised to make China great again has become the gravedigger of China's superpower dreams. China wants the world to believe it's a military superpower ready to challenge American dominance. But strip away the propaganda and you'll find another layer of the empire of lies. Yes, China has the world's largest military by personnel. Yes, they've been modernizing rapidly. But here's what they don't want you to know. Their military faces the same demographic crisis as the rest of the country. China's military is aging out. The one-child policy means fewer young men available for service. And those who are available, many are the same lying flat generation who have given up on everything else. But the real weakness isn't in personnel, it's in experience. China's last major military conflict was with Vietnam in 1979. Their military leaders have no experience managing large-scale modern warfare. Compare that to the United States, which has been conducting complex military operations continuously for decades. More revealing is what's happening to China's defense spending. Despite claims of military modernization, much of their defense budget goes to internal security, controlling their own population rather than projecting power globally. China's military buildup looks impressive on paper, but when your biggest security threat is your own citizens giving up on the system, that's not the foundation of global military power. Here's what we know for certain. China's Belt and Road Initiative, their supposed vehicle for global influence, is collapsing. Sri Lanka, under debt stress, leased its strategic Hambantota port to a Chinese state-owned firm for 99 years. Pakistan is struggling with Chinese debt payments. Instead of building influence, China has created a portfolio of bad debt around the world. The empire of lies thought it could buy global dominance through infrastructure loans. But when you're lending money you don't have to countries that can't pay it back, you're not building an empire, you're creating a house of cards. And now that house of cards is falling down. China's response? Double down on aggression. More threats against Taiwan, more confrontations in the South China Sea, more economic coercion against countries that displease it. This is how declining powers behave, not rising superpowers. But here's why this matters to everyone watching. When the world's second largest economy starts collapsing, the ripple effects are global. The global supply chains that seem so stable, they're being rewired around China's decline. The trade relationships that powered decades of growth, they're fracturing as countries realize they can't depend on an economy built on lies. And as China becomes more desperate, it becomes more dangerous. Economic collapse doesn't make authoritarian regimes moderate, it makes them radical. The economic foundation that was supposed to support China's rise to global superpower status simply isn't there anymore. You can't project power globally when your domestic economy is contracting, your population is aging, and your young people are opting out. The empire of lies is discovering that you can't lie your way to global dominance. Real power requires real economic strength, real demographic vitality, and real social cohesion. China has none of these things. But there's one final layer to China's empire of lies that almost nobody understands: the debt crisis that makes everything else look manageable. China's total debt exceeds 300% of GDP, higher than Japan at its bubble peak. Local governments owe $9 trillion in hidden debt alone. This creates a mathematical impossibility: debt growing faster than the economy. The only outcomes? Default or hyperinflation. Beijing knows this. That's why they're desperately manipulating statistics and forcing state companies to buy those empty apartments we talked about. The empire built on lies has painted itself into a corner. Here's the terrifying part: China's debt crisis isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's already causing real-world chaos in multiple provinces. Local government employees haven't been paid in months in some areas. Infrastructure projects are being abandoned mid-construction. Some cities can't afford basic services. The central government keeps promising bailouts, but they're running out of money too. Reports indicate China's foreign reserves face pressure as capital flees the country. They're selling U.S. Treasury bonds to fund domestic spending, clear sign of desperation. International lenders are starting to notice. Rating agencies have adjusted China's outlook, and foreign banks are restricting lending to Chinese entities. The world is slowly realizing that China's promises might not be as solid as they once appeared. When China's debt bomb explodes, it won't just destroy China, it will trigger the biggest economic reshuffling since World War II. Global supply chains will snap, trade relationships will fracture, and the world will finally see what happens when a $17 trillion economy built on deception comes crashing down. So where does that leave us? China's superpower dream was always built on quicksand. The impressive growth numbers were manipulated. The gleaming cities were largely empty. The demographic dividend has turned into a demographic disaster, and the property market that created middle-class wealth has destroyed it instead. This isn't just an economic crisis or a demographic problem. This is the systematic unraveling of an empire that was never as powerful as it appeared. The lies are catching up with reality, and reality is harsh. But here's what makes this collapse different from other economic disasters. China built its entire national identity around inevitable rise. They convinced not just the world, but themselves, that their dominance was destiny. When that narrative crumbles, it doesn't just hurt economically. It creates an existential crisis for the entire civilization. What is China if not the rising superpower? What is the Communist Party's legitimacy if not delivering prosperity? These are questions Beijing can't answer without admitting the empire of lies was exactly that, lies. China will likely remain a major economy, but the idea that they were destined to surpass America and dominate the 21st century, that was always a fantasy built on fabricated data, unsustainable debt, and demographic impossibilities. The most shocking part? We're watching this collapse happen in real time. While most of the world still believes in China's inevitable rise, the foundation has already cracked beyond repair. The empire of lies is crumbling from within, and no amount of propaganda can hold back economic gravity forever. What do you think? Are we witnessing the end of China's superpower ambitions, or is this just a temporary setback? And what does this mean for the global balance of power in the coming decades? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to Fall of Nations for more deep dives into the forces reshaping our world. Hit that notification bell because the story of China's empire of lies is far from over.
Vladimir Putin used to terrify his enemies. Now he fears his friends. After 2 decades in power, the man who once ruled Russia with an iron grip is looking over his shoulder at his own inner circle. From mysterious purges to airborne assassinations, the walls inside the Kremlin are closing in. Billionaires are speaking out. Generals are vanishing, and Russia's most dangerous mutiny didn't come from protesters in the streets, but from insiders who once served him loyally. Putin fears death is coming, not from NATO, not from Ukraine, but from within. And here's the terrifying part, he might be right. So, how did the strongman become the paranoid? Who is betraying him? And who's next? Let's unravel the slow-motion collapse in Putin's empire and the betrayal that could bring him down. Here's a question. What do Putin and his new BFF Kim Jong-un have in common? Look underground to find the real answer. Putin doesn't like traveling by air all that much. He likes to talk about Russian stealth technology, but he probably doesn't trust it on his own plane. There's another way, an underground armored train network that's a lot harder to track. It makes Putin more comfortable because he's pathologically afraid for his life. Those aren't our words, they come from the lips of Gleb Karakulov. Who is that? He used to be an officer with the Federal Protection Service, Russia's version of the Secret Service. According to him, Putin increasingly surrounds himself with an impenetrable barrier of security routines. This might not be as surprising as it seems. Remember those pictures from 2020 in Russia? Putin received visitors behind a table that almost looked as long as a football field because he was so scared of coming down with the virus. That was the first glimpse of the real Putin, the one you don't usually see posing for the cameras. He was actually too well prepared for coronavirus quarantines. He's long quarantined himself from anything that comes his way until it's been thoroughly tested. Like a tyrant out of Greek myth, Putin has an army of food tasters who carefully screen everything on the menu before it ever even gets to touch his taste buds. And they're not alone. There's a private corps of engineers setting up Putin's exclusive communications network, from his dashas, train, plane, and luxury yachts. He apparently only trusts information from these secure devices, set up by the people who call him the boss, and treat him like he's a modern-day pharaoh. And like a pharaoh, his network of palaces is fortified to the brim, and he demanded even more when he decided to launch his war. Wait, special military operation. For example, Moscow now has about 60 air defense systems around its perimeter. It makes sense at first. Moscow is home to the Russian government and 13 million other people. But try this one on for size. Putin has a private estate at Lake Valdai. It's home to his supposed girlfriend and their children. There are at least 12 Pantsir S-1 missile defense systems around just this estate. Some of them were pulled from St. Petersburg to bolster the estate's fortifications, even though the city's been a target for Ukrainian attacks. Why? Protecting himself apparently matters more than protecting the troops at the front, or the civilians in a city of 5.6 million people. Whenever possible, Putin likes to hide behind these defenses. He avoids going abroad whenever he can, even to the countries that aren't obligated to arrest him if he steps foot on their soil. More at 11. But all of these protocols and procedures might not just be complete paranoia. The real reason for Putin's fear isn't just what he sees in the mirror, it's who he no longer sees in the room. One of those people is Yevgeny Prigozhin. He and the Wagner Group helped Russia to get through its darkest period in the war, back when Ukrainian forces were putting Russian forces on the run in Kherson and Kharkiv oblasts in the summer and autumn of 2022. Wagner then came in and stabilized the front around the infamous town of Bakhmut. But somewhere along the way, Prigozhin started to think that his men were suffering for nothing. So he did the unthinkable. He led a mutiny the likes of which Russia hadn't seen since 1917. He seized the strategic city of Rostov-on-Don across the Sea of Azov from Crimea. Then he took down military aircraft and marched, making rapid progress. He stopped just short of Moscow with hardly a shot fired in opposition. Putin was strangely absent during the crisis. It took the efforts of his puppet, Alexander Lukashenko, in Belarus to bring the situation to a peaceful end. The military's impotence during the affair made him wonder, if the Wagner Group actually made it to Moscow, who would be the first to stab him in the back? Something had to be done, and like a loyal KGB man to the end, Putin decided it was better to strike first from the shadows, until it became public with a spectacular fireball. Prigozhin died under mysterious circumstances a couple of months later when his private jet exploded. Nikolai Patrushev, the secretary of Putin's Security Council, ordered the assassination, but Putin definitely approved. It was a move right out of Stalin's playbook. Putin was sending a message, think twice before crossing me. And just like Stalin, Putin wasn't stopping there. Russian dictators rarely do. The full-blown purge had come back into vogue again. Not even a month after the Wagner revolt, the former FSB man, Igor Girkin, was thrown behind bars. Why? He made the mistake of criticizing Putin's handling of the war in public. In Russia, that counts as extremism. Girkin might have been sympathetic to the war and a spook just like Putin, but that doesn't matter here. Sending the message was what mattered, and the boss still wasn't done. General Sergei Surovikin was suddenly missing at the end of August 2023. Once the leader of Russia's Air Force, and then commander of all of Russia's forces in Ukraine, he disappeared, supposedly for being a little too friendly with Prigozhin. Worse, he apparently knew about the mutiny beforehand. So Putin acted. Surovikin didn't bite the dust. He was basically just given an irrelevant diplomatic post in the Commonwealth of Independent States, the 21st century way of being packed off to a dacha in Siberia. But others weren't as lucky as him. That November, Lieutenant General Vladimir Sviridov and his wife were found dead in their home. Sviridov became a critic of the Russian war effort. He said that the Russian military had displayed a lack of readiness. The official cause of death was carbon monoxide poisoning. Then, Roman Starovoyt was found dead in his car on July 7th of this year, just hours after Putin fired him from his job as Russia's transport minister for reasons we don't know. Officially, he committed suicide, and Putin was shocked at his death. Officially. We're taking these things with a grain of salt because there's a pattern here. Between the start of the war and the summer of 2025, at least 24 high-ranking figures in Putin's regime died in mysterious ways. And even the ones that do survive and don't wind up disgraced still have to be walking on eggshells. But that might not work forever. Prigozhin's rebellion revealed just how little support for Putin there is, even within elite circles in Russia. There is, in fact, a quiet war for power going on, and one side is already winning. Fear can only rule the day for so long. The upper tiers of Putin's regime might be under constant surveillance, but a czar needs more than that to stay in power. Even he can't make money appear out of thin air. Russia's economy depends on one thing: keeping the export of natural resources going, especially oil and natural gas. And oligarchs have been allowed to get rich doing it. There was a silent agreement between them and their boss going back to the time he first took power. What's the point of being an oligarch if you can't live like one? The special military operation was supposed to end in a few days. It didn't, and Russia's been under lock and key ever since. So they aren't living as large. Their foreign bank accounts got frozen, their luxury property got seized, and those profitable overseas business deals got killed. Life's not fair. But with Putin putting on his Stalin face, what's the likelihood of anyone really pushing back? It actually didn't take long. Last August, as Ukraine was invading the Kursk Oblast and making Russia's finances go on a roller coaster ride, Oleg Deripaska called for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire and said that Putin was mad to invade his neighbor. That's not a household name outside of Russia, but inside of it, he's one of the people that make the economy move. He's the founder of Basic Element, one of Russia's leading mining, agriculture, and industrial conglomerates. He was once Russia's richest man and now has a net worth of $4 billion, according to Forbes. But was Deripaska speaking only for himself? No. Going out on a limb alone is bad for one's prospects of living long in Putin's Russia. There's a growing list of malcontents. Alexander Novak, Russia's deputy prime minister, warned that if things keep on going as they were, Russia might have to stop exporting energy to secure the home supply. That must have made the oligarchs even more nervous. Then came the real scare. After Ukraine did a little special military operation of its own in Russian territory, Georgy Zagrevsky said that Putin should be removed from power. So who is this guy? The name kind of gives it away. He operates Paladin, another private military company like the Wagner Group. And that had to have given Putin a fear of déjà vu. Even Nikolai Patrushev, Putin's chosen hitman in the Prigozhin affair, apparently voiced his doubts about the direction of the war and speculated about the country's future if Putin got weaker. He was conveniently relieved of his post and appointed as a presidential aide instead, where Putin can watch him more closely. But the problems deepen. As Putin's elite began to cautiously express doubts about their boss, Russia's people are already making their choice more loudly, and it's not him. Putin was re-elected as the president of Russia in March 2024 with 88.4% of the vote. That margin was a little too comfortable. International observers thought there was an unprecedented level of fraud in the tally. Despite that, his regime still needed to force people into voting for him, especially the unfortunates in the occupied territories of Ukraine. But why would a supposedly popular leader need to go to such lengths? You know why. It's tough to live in Russia these days. Hospitals are more overstretched now than they ever were during the pandemic. Power outages in the Russian winter have become common. People are voting with their feet. At least 650,000 Russians have left the country since 2022, and they've been going to over 70 destination countries that seem to offer them a better future than the motherland these days. These are disproportionately Russia's best and brightest people, and they're resisting their dictatorial leader in one of the only ways they know how. To them, he had broken his biggest promise. If they can't make their money, there is no point in staying. Putin came to power at a time when post-Soviet Russia was in chaos. The upheaval forced Boris Yeltsin to resign early, so Putin had to do something fast. His answer was to extend a simple contract. Putin would restore order, grow the economy, and revive national pride. The oligarchs and well-educated would get to make their coin. In exchange, he got to steadily end Russia's brief flirtation with Western-style liberalism. He kept his promise in the 2000s and 2010s. There were some protests here and there, but Russia's GDP per capita steadily rose, from a dismal $1,331 in 1999 when he came to power, to $15,941 in 2013. Then it dropped. 2014 was when the little green men took over Crimea and the first round of Western sanctions got slapped on. So it collapsed to $8,663 in 2 years, but then rebounded. In 2022, it was $15,620 again. But the roller coaster was far from done. The early war rush brought a sugar high and things looked okay. But when the blitzkrieg failed and attrition kicked in, things started to change fast. Recessions set in. The Russian economy rebounded in 2023 and 2024, but only because war spending was taking up a third of Russia's federal budget and 6% of its GDP. A ruble spent in one place can't be spent in another, so other things in Russia started to suffer. Inflation made things like eggs and sugar too much for ordinary Russians to afford. Interest rates rose to over 20%. No new businesses or jobs, just a lot of stuff that was now really expensive. The only comfort was that it wasn't getting even more expensive anymore. What's getting cheaper? Housing. Home sales dropped by 40% between the summer of 2024 and this past summer. Good for people looking for a starter home, bad for property values. That's not just the oligarchs losing money on their mansion apartments in Moscow or St. Petersburg. It's ordinary families losing most of their life savings. So that's why Russia's educated people are leaving. The place isn't North Korea, yet, but Russian authorities are going to more and more lengths to crack down on anti-war activists in the country. Protests have declined since the war started, but that might just be plugging the pressure, only for it to show up in another place. Now, with the enemies above and below, Putin's final shield is loyalty, but that too is cracking. People are starting to talk about the unthinkable, a potential successor to Putin. Some of this is natural. He's getting old. He just turned 73. But there's more to this than that. With the economy slowing and the prospect of a decisive victory in Ukraine pretty much impossible, some of Russia's elites are worried about a potential revolution. And he knows it. Abbas Galyamov understands Putin's thoughts more than most. He used to be a speechwriter for Russia's boss. According to him, Putin always absorbs the mood of other elites. That shouldn't surprise anybody. It's exactly what a former KGB man would do. He knows that the likes of Deripaska weren't speaking just for themselves. So Putin has to take other measures, more subtle ones, because even he can't just go around killing everyone and expect the country to continue functioning. The goal? Keep any potential successor obedient, if not silent. Putin doesn't get around much these days. Since he has an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court, he has to be careful about where he goes. All of its 125 member states are obligated to take him into custody the moment he steps foot on their soil. But still, Russia needs to maintain its international relations. Theoretically, it should, because it has a prime minister, Mikhail Mishustin, sort of. Putin seems to be under the impression that Mishustin is a threat to his authority, especially because he doesn't seem to be a hardliner. Putin hasn't moved against him yet, but keeps him close, just like a dog on a leash. He doesn't let Mishustin out of the country much. He sends Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov instead. Why? Because some people think Mishustin is a compromise candidate for a post-Putin Russia. Lavrov isn't a threat. People say he's a faithful weathercock of Putin. That's a double-edged sword, though. Not having a faithful weathercock for a prime minister might wind up doing Putin in if the going gets too tough. Why? Putin hasn't named a clear successor. Surprisingly, that's a tactic out of the playbook of England's Queen Elizabeth I, who knew that there would be a power struggle if she named one. But in theory, the Prime Minister of Russia is supposed to be the second highest official in the country. If something were to happen to Putin, he would take over. In the event of a catastrophic military defeat, or the crash that's sure to come whenever the war spending ends, There's someone waiting in the wings to take over if elites like Deripaska and Zagrevsky decide that enough is enough and make for a better coordinated revolt. Shushtin might be a good compromise for a caretaker government. But other strongmen are waiting in the wings too. There's the Chechen dictator, Ramzan Kadyrov. He was once a close ally of Prigozhin, but even so, he's been good at playing Putin, achieving a high level of local autonomy despite Russia's increasingly centralized state. In May, he declared his desire to retire, but also said that only Putin could make that decision. Perhaps he's just trying to lie low and strike if the time is right, maybe by backing a preferred successor. Russia's minorities, like the Chechens, have taken a disproportionate share of the million-plus casualties, after all. Putin's fall could be the chance for greater freedom. Either way, Putin's image has changed a lot in the past 5 years. Before COVID, he presented himself as a tough guy, a judo black belt, a diver that recovered ancient Greek urns from beneath the waves, a tiger handler. But people should have paid more attention to that hockey game in 2019 when he scored 8 goals and then fell on his face. Since then, he's sat behind absurdly long tables, hides behind fortresses that would make the most paranoid Roman emperors blush, and regularly keeps his thumb on everyone else around him. All this isolation isn't empowering, though. It's alienating, and Russia's mini-bosses are starting to wonder how beneficial it really is to keep their Don around. We do hear the weather in North Korea is great this time of year.